It's late, and the cold night air presses against my skin as I sit beside the campfire. The orange flames crackle and spit sparks into the dark forest sky. My breath makes little clouds in the chilly air, and the shadows of the trees stretch and twist far beyond the small clearing where I've pitched my tent. I'm alone out here, miles from the nearest town, on a weekend camping trip that I thought would be peaceful and quiet. But something about tonight feels different, heavier, darker. I got here in the afternoon. The trail was longer and rougher than I remembered from the map. My backpack felt heavier with every step, packed with the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, and water. The forest was dense, full of tall pines and oaks, with the occasional broken branch and thick underbrush blocking the way. The sun was already dipping low by the time I found the clearing, a perfect little spot surrounded by thick woods on all sides, with a small stream trickling nearby. It was just what I needed, away from the noise, away from people. I set up the tent quickly, eager to have shelter before nightfall. The light was fading fast, and the forest was already changing. The daytime sounds, birds chirping, insects buzzing, were gone. Instead, I could hear the rustling of leaves as the wind moved through the branches, the occasional snap of a twig far off, and the quiet gurgle of the stream. I built a fire, arranging dry twigs and pine cones, and soon the flames flickered and warmed me. As night fully settled, the forest grew alive with new sounds. Owls hooted in the distance, some rustling came from the bushes nearby, and every now and then, I thought I heard something heavier. Footsteps or a crunch on the forest floor, too heavy to be just a squirrel or a rabbit. I told myself it was just the wind or an animal moving through the woods, nothing to worry about. But then, the strange feeling settled in my chest, like I was being watched. I scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, but all I could see were deep shadows and the shapes of the trees. The campfire's glow reached only a few feet, leaving the rest of the woods to swallow any light. My heart started to beat a little faster. I told myself to relax. I'm in a national forest popular for camping. People hike here all the time. Nothing to be scared of. I moved closer to the fire and pulled my jacket tighter around me. I checked my phone for the time, 10:30 p.m. No signal, of course. I had expected that. It's part of why I wanted to come here, to disconnect. But now I wished I had some way to call for help, just in case. The wind picked up suddenly, sending a chill through the clearing. The fire sputtered and flared, then calmed. Then I heard it again, soft but clear, something heavy moving through the underbrush, coming closer. I froze, eyes wide, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. No human voice, no footsteps on the dirt path I had come down. Just the sound of something walking slowly but deliberately through the brush. Not fast, but steady and close. I grabbed a stick from beside the fire and held it like a makeshift club. My muscles tensed, ready to run or defend myself. The sound stopped. Silence. My breathing was loud in my ears. Suddenly, a low growl, barely audible, echoed from the edge of the clearing. I swallowed hard. Wolves? Bears? The nearest town was 15 miles away, but wildlife was common here. Bears sometimes wandered through, but they usually avoided people. I threw a small log onto the fire, making it crackle loudly. The growling stopped. Minutes passed, slow and heavy. The fire burned low, the warmth fading. I started packing up my things, deciding it was better to get out of here and find the trail back to my car. But the darkness pressed in, thick and cold. My flashlight was in the tent, and I didn't want to leave it alone. I grabbed it and shined it into the trees. The beam caught movement, two bright eyes reflecting back at me. My heart stopped. The eyes blinked slowly, then disappeared into the darkness. A large animal, probably a wolf or coyote, but bigger than any I'd seen before. I shone the light where it went, but the woods were empty again. I took a deep breath and told myself to stay calm. Animals were wild, yes, but they usually kept their distance. I was careful not to turn my back on the dark. I kept the flashlight ready and the stick in my hand. After what felt like hours, the noises stopped. The forest quieted down again, the wind settling. I finally managed to crawl into the tent, zipped it tight, and lay on my sleeping bag. The tent was thin, but it felt like a barrier between me and whatever was out there. I tried to sleep, but every crack and snap outside made my heart race. My mind went over every story I had ever heard about people lost or attacked in the woods. I told myself it was just fear making things worse. Still, I wasn't truly safe. Not here. At dawn, I slipped out quietly, careful not to make noise. The forest looked peaceful, almost normal in the pale morning light. I grabbed my backpack and started hiking back the way I had come. The trail was harder to follow than I remembered. There were broken branches and disturbed leaves, signs that something or someone else had been through here during the night. I tried not to panic, but kept moving quickly. After a couple of hours, I finally saw the edge of the forest and the dirt road where I had parked my car. Relief hit me like a wave, but just as I was about to step onto the road, I spotted something on the ground. A crude, rough scratch on a tree trunk, fresh and deep, too large to be made by a small animal. A warning, a sign. I looked around, scanning the forest edge carefully. No sign of any person or animal, but I knew better than to stay. I jumped in my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. Driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the dark tree line shrinking behind me. The forest was quiet again, but I knew what I had heard, what I had felt. I wasn't alone. Something had been watching me, following me, testing me in the night. I never went camping alone again after that. The forest is full of wildlife, and some of it is dangerous, but some things you just don't see coming. And sometimes, the scariest part is knowing that something is out there, waiting in the dark, beyond the reach of your firelight. It was the kind of late summer evening that felt thick with heat and quiet in the woods, the kind that wraps around your skin and makes everything seem a little closer, a little heavier. I had set out alone for this camping trip, needing some time away from the noise and pressure of city life, away from people and distractions. The plan was simple. Find a small clearing deep in the forest, pitch a tent, make a fire, and spend a couple of nights under the stars. Nothing fancy, no distractions. Just me and the wilderness. I drove my old pickup truck down a gravel road that turned narrower and more broken the further I went. At some point, the GPS stopped being reliable, but I didn't mind. I had a map in my backpack and a compass. I found a spot that looked promising. Near a bend in a shallow creek, surrounded by tall pine and birch trees, with a small clearing just big enough for my tent and a fire ring. It was isolated enough to feel remote, but still close to a trail I'd followed in earlier hikes. I unloaded my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small cooking stove, and some basic tools. The sun was starting to dip behind the thick canopy, casting long shadows that made the trees look like dark towers. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth, with a faint hint of smoke from a distant campfire, or maybe just a burn-off somewhere far off. The first night was quiet, mostly. I had a fire going, just enough to keep the chill off and to cook a simple dinner. Some canned beans and a small piece of jerky. I sat close to the fire, watching the flames flicker, listening to the soft rush of the creek nearby and the occasional rustle of leaves. As the night deepened, the woods seemed to hold their breath. No wind, no animals making noise, nothing. At some point, I felt like I wasn't alone. I can't explain it any other way. It wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural. It was the way the forest seemed to grow dense, as if something or someone was watching, moving just beyond the edge of the firelight. I checked my knife and flashlight, making sure they were within reach. I didn't hear anything definite, no footsteps or voices, but the feeling settled over me like a weight. The next morning, I woke early to the sound of birds, but something was off. The fire had died out overnight, which wasn't unusual, but my water container had been knocked over. I'm sure I hadn't done it. The ground around my tent had subtle signs of disturbance, broken twigs, flattened grass. Nothing dramatic, but enough to make me uneasy. I packed up slowly, keeping an eye on the woods. I noticed that some of the footprints around my camp didn't look like mine. They were bigger, with a wider stride, and they disappeared into the trees. No animal tracks I recognized, just human. I kept moving, trying not to panic. My plan was to hike back to the truck, but the forest suddenly felt like a maze. The trails I thought I knew twisted and forked in ways that made no sense. My compass spun weirdly in my hand. The GPS showed me in the middle of the woods, but the map said I should be closer to the road. That's when I heard the sound. The crunch of leaves behind me, soft and slow, like someone was stepping carefully but deliberately through the underbrush. I stopped and listened. The noise stopped too, but I could feel eyes on me. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight into the trees, but I saw nothing. For hours I walked, never sure if I was going the right way. My water was running low. I could hear the creek still, which gave me some hope, but I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. Shadows shifting, branches bending. But when I turned, nothing was there. As the sun started to fall again, I found myself back near the clearing where I'd camped. My tent was still there, but the fire pit was cold, and there were more footprints. Larger footprints, closer to the tent than before. It hit me hard. Someone had been watching me, waiting, maybe following. I tried to keep calm and pack my gear quickly, deciding to hike straight back to the truck as fast as I could. I stuffed everything into my backpack, slung it on, and started moving through the darkening forest. The woods closed in faster than before. Every step felt heavier, like the trees were pressing in around me. My heart pounded loud in my ears. I caught the faintest sound again. Leaves crunching, twigs snapping. It was getting closer. Suddenly, something cracked sharply to my right. I spun around, heart in my throat, flashlight trembling in my hand. A shape darted behind a tree. I froze. There was definitely someone else here. I debated what to do. Yell? Run? Hide? None of it felt right. I chose to keep moving, trying not to look back, pretending I hadn't seen anything. The path got worse. I stumbled over roots and rocks, cutting my hand on a sharp branch. My flashlight flickered, the batteries dying faster than I thought. I reached into my pack for spares but dropped them in panic. As I bent down to grab them, I heard a breath. Sharp, close, just behind me. I whipped around again. No one, but the feeling was undeniable. Someone had been right behind me. I picked up the batteries, changed them quickly, and kept going. Then, a sudden loud crack echoed through the forest, like a branch breaking under heavy weight. I ran without thinking, stumbling and falling. My hands and knees scraped against the dirt and stones. I heard something crash through the brush behind me, faster and louder. My mind screamed at me to keep running, but my body was spent. I was out of breath, muscles burning. Then, unexpectedly, I saw a clearing ahead. The headlights of my truck shone faintly through the trees. Relief surged through me. I sprinted the last few yards, tears blurring my vision. I threw open the door, slammed it shut behind me, locked it, and started the engine with shaking hands. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone chasing me. Nothing. I stopped at a gas station down the road, called the police, and told them what happened. They took my statement seriously but said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. I never found out who or what was in those woods with me. I don't think it was a ghost or anything supernatural. I think it was a person. Someone who watched, who followed, who maybe waited for the right moment. And that night, I got out just in time. It was supposed to be just a simple weekend camping trip. I wanted to get away from the city, from the noise, the crowds, and the constant buzz of everyday life. I needed some quiet, just me, nature, and a few days of fresh air. I packed my gear carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, flashlight, extra batteries, a small stove, and my trusty pocket knife. I checked the weather forecast before leaving. It said clear skies, mild temperatures, and no rain. Perfect conditions for camping. The drive was long but peaceful. The further I went, the fewer cars I saw, until eventually I was on a narrow dirt road, surrounded by thick trees on either side. Birds chirped overhead, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. The sun was low in the sky when I found a small clearing, far enough from the main trail to feel secluded but still reachable. It was just what I wanted. I pulled over, unloaded my gear, and set up my tent carefully. I chose a spot with soft ground, under a canopy of tall fir trees. Around me, the forest was dense but not oppressive. A small creek ran nearby, its gentle bubbling a soothing background sound. I gathered some dry wood and started a small fire in a stone ring I built, making sure it was contained and safe. The first night was calm. The fire crackled and the sky was clear, filled with stars. I lay in my sleeping bag inside the tent, listening to the sounds of the forest, leaves rustling, the occasional snap of a twig, the distant hoot of an owl. I felt at peace. This was exactly what I needed. The next morning, I woke early to the smell of damp earth and the fresh scent of pine. I made some coffee on my little stove and ate a simple breakfast of granola and dried fruit. I planned to explore a little, so I packed a small day bag with water, some snacks, my pocket knife, and a map I had printed out before the trip. I followed a narrow trail that wound through the woods, occasionally crossing the creek on slippery stones. The forest was alive with birdsong and the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I walked for a few hours, enjoying the solitude and the fresh air. The trail led me to a small hill that overlooked a wide valley filled with trees. The view was breathtaking. As the sun climbed higher, I headed back to camp. The quiet stillness of the forest felt comforting, but also a little strange. It was so isolated here that I didn't see or hear another person all day. It was almost too quiet, but I told myself that was exactly why I came. No noise, no distractions, just nature. Back at camp, I spent the afternoon chopping more wood and setting up a better fire pit. I also cleaned my gear and made sure everything was in order for the night. The sun was beginning to set when I noticed something odd. Near the edge of the clearing, close to the creek, I saw a series of footprints in the soft mud. They were fresh. Someone had been here recently. The prints were large, too big for a deer or any small animal. They looked like human footprints, but they weren't just normal hiking boots. The tread was deep and rough like heavy work boots. I scanned the area carefully, but I saw no other signs. No trash, no campfire remains, no discarded food wrappers. Just the prints leading from the edge of the woods into my clearing. A chill ran down my spine. I had come here for solitude, but someone else was nearby. I tried to calm myself, telling myself maybe a hunter or another camper had passed by earlier in the day. I had seen no one, but maybe they had walked quietly past. Still, I decided to make my fire bigger than usual, and I kept my flashlight and knife close by. The night grew colder. The fire flickered as the wind picked up, and the shadows cast by the trees around my tent stretched and twisted. I lay awake for hours, listening for any sounds, footsteps, voices, anything out of the ordinary. But the forest remained silent, except for the usual rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a branch. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint sound coming from just outside the clearing. It was a low, dragging noise, like someone slowly moving through the underbrush. I froze, heart pounding. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The sound stopped abruptly. Then, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, crunching on the dried leaves and twigs just beyond the firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the dark. The beam cut through the night, but I saw nothing. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deeper, almost suffocating. I considered packing up and leaving right then, but the thought of moving in the dark, through unknown forest paths, without any idea of where I was terrifying too. So I stayed put, holding my knife tightly and keeping the flashlight trained on the edge of the clearing. After what felt like hours, the sounds disappeared. The forest returned to its usual quiet. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, alert for any movement. The next morning, I was exhausted but relieved to see daylight. I decided to pack up immediately and leave. As I gathered my things, I noticed more signs. More footprints, some closer to the tent, and this time they circled the clearing several times. There were broken branches, disturbed leaves, and even a few scraps of cloth caught on a bush. I knew then I wasn't alone, and hadn't been for a while. I moved quickly but carefully, making sure to keep my knife in hand and my eyes scanning the forest edges. The path back to my car felt longer than before, every rustle and shadow setting my nerves on edge. As I reached the dirt road, I spotted tire tracks in the mud. Someone had driven in and out recently. I had no idea who or why, but the thought made my skin crawl. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and started the engine without hesitation. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. The whole trip that was supposed to be peaceful had turned into something else. Something that left me questioning the safety of being alone in the woods. No ghosts, no monsters, just a real, very human fear. The fear of being watched, stalked, or worse, trapped in a place where no one could hear you scream. When I got home, I reported what I found to the local ranger station. They said they hadn't had any recent reports of missing persons or criminal activity in the area, but they promised to send someone to check the clearing. I gave them the exact location and details. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't noticed those footprints, or if I'd gone to sleep that first night. I realized how vulnerable I had been, how easy it could be for someone to sneak up on a lone camper. I changed the way I think about being out in nature, appreciating its beauty but never underestimating its dangers. I'm still not sure who those footprints belong to. Maybe someone hunting illegally, maybe someone homeless trying to find shelter, or maybe someone with darker intentions. But I do know one thing for sure. Being alone in the woods means more than just facing the elements. Sometimes the scariest thing is knowing you're not truly alone. I had always liked being alone in the woods. It gave me a kind of peace that I couldn't find anywhere else. Cities were too loud, and even the suburbs felt packed tight. But deep in the forest, with nothing but trees, dirt, wind, and my own footsteps, I felt like I could breathe fully. That's why I planned a solo trip up to Ridge Trail, a long, lesser-known hiking route in the mountains a few hours away from home. Most people preferred the easier, well-marked trails closer to the parking areas, but Ridge Trail was tucked away behind some narrow logging roads, only accessible by a bumpy 4x4 route that snaked up past some abandoned fire roads. It was exactly the kind of place I wanted to disappear into for a few days. I set off early on a Wednesday morning in mid-September. The weather was supposed to be clear all week, with cool nights and warm days, perfect for hiking. My plan was simple. Park at the end of the service road, hike 6 or 7 miles in, make camp near the ridge, and spend a couple of nights up there. Maybe do some sketching or reading, then head back. Nothing complicated. I had a good pack, stove, food, water filter, tarp, sleeping bag, med kit, satellite GPS beacon. I wasn't careless about the wilderness, even if I liked being off-grid. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail climbed steadily, winding through tall pine forests and broken stretches of rock. I passed a few deer early on, and at one point a hawk circled overhead. The air smelled clean and earthy, and the silence stretched around me like a blanket. After about 5 miles, I reached a small plateau where the trees thinned out, and I could see the mountains stretching out for miles. I took a break, drank water, and just sat still for a while. Eventually, I pushed further toward the ridge. The trail got thinner and harder to follow, but I had a printed map and GPS coordinates saved on my offline map app, so I wasn't too worried. Around 4 p.m., I found a good spot near a rocky outcrop. It was flat, dry, and slightly elevated with some natural cover from the wind. I pitched my small one-man tent, made a little fire pit with stones, and gathered dry sticks and branches nearby. As the sun dipped, the temperature dropped quick, so I got some soup cooking and layered up. By the time it was fully dark, the woods had gone completely still. No wind, no insects, no sounds at all except the occasional crack of a log shifting in the fire. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up through the mesh of the tent at the stars. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. The first strange thing I noticed was around midnight. I had gotten up to pee and was standing near a tree not far from the tent when I heard a sound. It wasn't loud, more like a soft crunch. Dry leaves under a shoe, maybe 20 or 30 feet off. I froze. It wasn't an animal noise, no scamper, no brush movement. Just one clear, human-like step. Then silence. I stood still for a minute, waiting. Nothing else happened. No footsteps, no lights. I slowly backed up to the tent and zipped myself inside, heart racing a little. I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a deer stepped weird, or maybe I stepped on something without realizing it. I turned my flashlight off and lay still, ears open. The forest stayed quiet. The next morning, everything seemed normal. I made coffee and oatmeal, looked around camp, checked for prints or disturbed ground. Nothing. I packed up a small day pack and decided to hike another mile or so further down the ridge. The view was supposed to be better the further out you went. I made my way through some dense brush, following faint trail markers, until I reached a sloping area with exposed stone. From there, I could see for miles, layers of blue mountains and valleys, untouched and wild. I sat on a rock for a while, eating trail mix and writing in my journal. That's when I noticed it. Far off to my left, maybe a few hundred yards down the slope, there was a thin line of smoke rising above the trees. Not much, but enough to notice. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else up here. Ridge Trail was unmaintained and barely advertised. The nearest ranger station was miles away, and there were no marked campsites past the first mile. I felt uneasy. Someone else was out there. Maybe another hiker, or maybe someone not supposed to be here. I watched the smoke for a while. It looked like it came from a small fire, probably a campfire. But the weird part was that there had been no sign of anyone on the trail. No prints, no gear left behind. And if they were camping there, why so far off the actual path? I made my way back to my camp before it got late. I thought about packing up and heading back early, but I didn't want to overreact. I had food for 2 more days and the weather was still perfect. Maybe someone else just had the same idea as me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I didn't sleep much. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of branches snapping. Not far from my tent. Sharp, quick breaks. Not like wind. Then a pause. Then more snapping, closer this time. I didn't move. I kept still, breathing slow. I reached for the small knife I kept inside the tent. Not that it would have helped much. The sounds continued, twigs cracking, then footsteps. Slow, steady, moving around the camp. Not running, just walking. No flashlight, no talking. Then silence again. I lay awake for what felt like an hour before I heard movement heading back into the trees. I didn't get out or look around until the sky started to turn gray with dawn. When I finally stepped outside, my stomach dropped. Someone had been in my camp. There were boot prints around the fire pit. Clear ones. They weren't mine. I checked my gear. Nothing was missing, but one of my water bottles had been moved, just a few feet from where I left it. The fire pit had been disturbed too, like someone had kicked a few of the rocks aside and then set them back half-heartedly. I stood there for a long time, just trying to figure out what to do. It wasn't wildlife. It wasn't my imagination. Someone had walked into my camp in the middle of the night and moved things around, quietly, without trying to be seen. That was enough for me. I packed up everything as fast as I could, stuffed the tent, rolled the bag, crammed food into the bear canister. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole time, expecting someone to step out from the trees, but nobody did. I started hiking back the way I came, moving fast. The trail looked different somehow. I felt like I kept hearing soft sounds behind me. Leaves crunching, sticks snapping, but every time I turned, nothing was there. I made it back to the small plateau around midday. I stopped for water and to catch my breath. My legs were sore, and my back ached from the heavy pack. I sat against a tree, and that's when I saw something that made my blood go cold. On the tree across from me, carved shallow into the bark, were 2 words: "Go back." They weren't there when I passed through yesterday. I would have noticed. The letters were rough, not deep, but clearly done by a knife or sharp object. Fresh, bark still curled from the edges. I stood up and left immediately, heart pounding, looking around at every angle as I walked. The hike back to the car felt like it took forever. Every branch snap sent a jolt through my spine. I checked behind me constantly. The last couple of miles, the trail narrowed between two thick walls of pine, and the shadows got long and deep. I moved as fast as I could without running, my boots slipping on loose soil and roots. When I finally saw my car, I felt a wave of relief. I dropped my pack in the back seat and was about to open the door when I noticed something hanging from the driver's side mirror. It was a shoelace, not mine, just a single black shoelace, tied in a simple knot, swinging gently in the breeze. I stared at it for a while. It wasn't there when I parked. Someone had been here. Maybe they followed me from the trail. Maybe they saw me arrive and waited. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I drove straight out, didn't stop until I hit a small gas station 2 hours away. I told the guy behind the counter that someone had messed with my stuff while I was hiking, and he just nodded and said I wasn't the first person to say something like that. Said people sometimes go too deep into those woods, and not all of them want company. That was all he said. I've never gone back to Ridge Trail, never even driven down that service road again. I still hike, but never alone and never that far off the grid. I don't know who was out there. I don't know if they followed me from the first night or if they just happened to come across my camp. But I know someone was there. I know they came close enough to touch my gear, walk around my tent, carve into trees, and leave things behind. And I know they didn't want me there. I had been planning a solo camping trip for a long time. Work had been grinding me down. City noise was making me feel numb, and I just needed to breathe in quiet. The kind of quiet you can only find deep in the woods. No phone signals, no roads, just tall trees, rustling leaves, and the kind of air that smells like damp earth and pine. I had picked a spot I found through a combination of topographic maps and some old blog posts. It wasn't an official campsite. It was deeper, past the popular trails, past the ones with trash cans and wooden signs. The kind of place you had to hike to using compass bearings and landmarks. The plan was to stay 3 nights. Just me, my gear, my tent, and a notebook to jot things down. No GPS, no music, nothing to pull me away from the now. I parked my car on a gravel shoulder off a narrow forest road. I locked everything up, threw my pack on, and headed straight into the woods. The first few miles were easy. The underbrush was low, and I could still hear the road behind me for a while. Birds chirped, branches snapped under my boots, and every now and then I saw an old beer can or a scrap of plastic, evidence of other hikers. But after about 2 hours, all signs of human activity disappeared. It was what I wanted. I started using the compass, picking out a line of trees to guide me, stopping only to drink and mark the path on a notepad. I wasn't using breadcrumbs or anything silly like that, but I had a system. It wasn't my first time doing this. I'd done a few solo hikes and off-grid camps before. Never this far, but I was confident. Maybe a little too confident. By the time the sun started lowering, the light shifted and made the forest feel different. The trees cast long shadows that moved when I did. The woods got quieter too, like the animals were settling in for the night. I found a flat patch near a dried-up creek bed. The soil was soft enough to drive in the tent stakes. I set up quickly. Tent, fire pit, small windscreen stove. Everything was by the book. After dinner, just some rice and jerky. I sat and listened. That's all I did for almost an hour. Just listened. I could hear things. Branches far off cracking. A distant owl. Maybe a fox. The wind sometimes sounded like whispers when it moved through the pines. I turned in early that night. I'd hiked a long way and I was sore. The kind of sore that makes your knees pulse when you lay down. I crawled into my sleeping bag and pulled the zipper tight. I always left the rainfly half open to let air in. I liked seeing out too, even if it made me a little uneasy sometimes. Sometime after midnight, I woke up, not from a dream or a sound, but because of that weird sense you get when something isn't right. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. The woods were silent now, completely silent, not even wind. I laid still for a long time, telling myself it was nothing. But then I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a soft, slow, steady crunching sound, like someone stepping carefully, 1 foot at a time, dry leaves being pressed into the ground. Then a pause, then another crunch. It stopped. I didn't breathe. My hand went to the knife I kept near the sleeping bag. I didn't unzip anything. I just stayed there, staring out through the tiny crack in the rainfly. I didn't sleep again that night. When morning came, I got out slowly. I walked the perimeter of my camp, listening, looking for anything. Nothing seemed touched. No broken branches. No prints I could see. I convinced myself it had just been a deer or something curious. That's what I wanted to believe. I made some instant coffee, packed a day bag, and hiked a short loop just to clear my head. When I got back that afternoon, I saw something strange. A pile of small rocks, maybe 10 of them, stacked neatly beside the tree about 20 feet from my tent. They hadn't been there before. I would have noticed. I checked everything. My food, my gear. Nothing was missing, but now I wasn't so sure I was alone. That second night, I built the fire a little higher. I kept my headlamp on my chest and my knife even closer. I didn't even try to sleep at first. I just sat there by the fire with my back to a tree, watching, waiting. Hours passed. The fire started to die down and I finally crawled into my tent, but I left my boots on. Again, in the middle of the night, I heard it. The same soft crunching sound. This time it came from behind the tent. Then it circled. Slow, deliberate steps, not rushing, like whoever it was knew I was awake. I didn't move. I didn't look out. I just laid there with my heart slamming in my ears. The steps stopped right beside the tent. I could hear breathing, not heavy, not loud, just enough to know it wasn't an animal. Then a quiet dragging sound, something being pulled across the ground. After that, silence again. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I got out and checked again. I found another stack of rocks. This one was closer, right by the tent, and next to it, half buried in the dirt, was a shoelace. Not mine. That's when I made the call to leave. I didn't care how far I had hiked or how much I wanted solitude. Something was wrong. I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands were shaking. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing just out of sight. The hike back wasn't easy. I was tired, paranoid, and constantly checking my six. Every twig snap made me flinch. I followed my notes and compass bearings, but something felt off. I should have reached the road by early afternoon, but it was almost sunset, and I still hadn't found it. That's when I noticed it. A tree I'd marked on the way in. A tall, forked birch with a scar down the side. I passed it again. It was impossible. I hadn't changed direction, hadn't doubled back. But somehow I'd walked in a big circle. I stopped and checked everything. Reoriented. Took a deep breath. Then I started again. My legs were starting to give out, but adrenaline was keeping me going. Just before it got too dark to see, I stumbled out onto the gravel road. I don't think I've ever felt more relief in my life. I practically ran the last half mile to my car. The car was untouched, exactly where I left it. I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I was back in the nearest town. I found a motel with a half-lit sign, checked in, and sat on the bed for nearly an hour just breathing. But that's not where it ended. A week after I got back, I was going through my gear, cleaning things, putting stuff away. When I opened the side pouch of my pack, something was in there. A rock, small, round, perfectly smooth, not like the ones from the forest floor. I didn't put it there, and wrapped around it was a strip of faded red cloth. I still have no idea who was out there with me or why they were messing with me. I didn't tell the police because, honestly, what would I say? That someone walked around my tent and left me a rock? Since then, I haven't gone camping alone again. I still hike. I still love the woods, but I stay on marked trails, stick to daylight, and never, ever go too far in. I learned something out there. You're not always alone, even when you think you are. And not every person in the woods wants to be found or wants you to leave. Some just want to watch, and I gave them 3 perfect nights to do it. I never thought a simple camping trip could turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It started out just like any other weekend getaway. Just me, some gear, and a little patch of wilderness I picked out after scrolling through a map for hours. I was looking for solitude, some peace away from the noise of the city, a break from the constant buzz of deadlines, emails, and meaningless chatter. What I got instead was a lesson I won't forget. I arrived at the spot just before sunset. The place was tucked away in a valley surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. The kind of place where the trees crowd so closely together that the sun barely touches the ground at noon, and the shadows get long and heavy by mid-afternoon. It was perfect for what I wanted: isolation and quiet. I had a small tent, a couple of sleeping bags, some canned food, water, a first aid kit, and a flashlight with extra batteries. No fancy gadgets, no GPS, just the basics. I wanted to disconnect completely. The first few hours were peaceful. I set up the tent near a little creek that gurgled softly, and I built a small fire pit out of stones I found nearby. I gathered some dry twigs and branches, careful to avoid the green ones that wouldn't catch. As the sky darkened, I cooked some beans over the fire and ate slowly, listening to the night sounds. The crackling fire, the soft rush of water, the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the wind. Felt good to be away from everything. But then things started to change, subtly at first. The wind picked up and brought with it a strange smell. Not the usual forest scent of pine and damp earth, but something metallic and sharp, like rusted iron mixed with something else, something burnt. It made me uneasy, but I shrugged it off. Maybe a nearby old mine or a forgotten campfire. I tried to focus on keeping the fire going and calming my nerves. As night deepened, I noticed something odd. The woods seemed too quiet. There was no normal wildlife noise. No crickets chirping, no frogs croaking, no small animals scurrying through the underbrush. Just silence. It was unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. That silence made the dark feel heavier, more oppressive. I shivered, pulled my jacket tighter around me, and glanced around nervously. Then, without warning, I heard it. The faint crunching of dry leaves, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me, just beyond the ring of firelight. My heart jumped. I froze, straining to listen. The noise stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. The footsteps were heavy, like someone or something was moving slowly through the forest, careful not to make too much noise, but definitely trying to get closer. I grabbed my flashlight and switched it on, the beam cutting through the blackness in front of me. I swung it around, trying to spot whatever was out there. Nothing. No eyes reflecting the light, no movement except the swaying branches. I kept the flashlight aimed in the direction of the sound for a long time, but the forest remained still. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon maybe, but something about the way the steps were paced didn't feel right. They were too heavy, too careful, almost like someone was stalking, trying not to be seen. My skin crawled. I debated packing up and leaving immediately, but I knew the trailhead was still a couple of miles away, and the only way back was by walking in the dark. I didn't want to risk getting lost or injured out here at night, so I stayed by the fire, heart pounding, listening to every sound. After a while, the footsteps stopped completely, and the forest noises slowly returned. The crickets came back, the frogs, the distant hoot of the owl. I told myself I was just imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks. I tried to relax and eventually fell asleep in my tent, the flashlight beside me, fingers barely able to hold still. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a sudden noise, a sharp crack, like a branch breaking, right outside my tent. My pulse hit the roof. I froze, barely daring to breathe. The noise repeated a few times, soft but deliberate, like someone was slowly moving around my campsite, stepping over branches and rocks. I reached for the flashlight and turned it on quickly, shining it outside through the thin fabric of the tent. The light caught something moving, a shadow, tall and thin, shifting just beyond the firelight's reach. My heart slammed against my ribs. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck. The figure didn't move fast, didn't rush. It just stood there, barely visible, watching me. My mind raced. Was it someone lost? A hunter? A criminal hiding out? I had no way to know. The only thing I knew for sure was I was completely alone, and there was someone or something out there that wasn't making a sound, just watching me. The minutes dragged on like hours. I thought about grabbing my knife from my backpack, but I was terrified of making noise or sudden movements that might provoke whoever was out there. The figure didn't come closer, didn't retreat, just stayed still, waiting. Finally, I forced myself to speak, just a low shout to make my presence known. "Hey, I'm here. I'm not alone." The shadow jerked suddenly, then vanished into the darkness. I waited for a long time after that, but the silence returned, except now it was colder, heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath again. I didn't sleep after that. I sat by the dying fire, flashlight in hand, listening to every sound, eyes wide and scanning the woods. At first light, I packed up everything quickly, not caring if I left some gear behind. My hands shook as I rolled up the tent and threw my stuff into my backpack. I started walking back along the trail, my steps quick and unsteady. Every rustle, every snap of twig made me flinch. I kept looking behind me, half expecting the figure to appear again. I made it back to my car without seeing or hearing anything else. I locked the doors and sat inside, trying to catch my breath. The relief was overwhelming. Later, when I got home and went through my backpack, I found something odd. Underneath my water bottle, tucked in the side pocket, was a small scrap of paper, folded neatly. I didn't remember putting it there. I unfolded it carefully. On it was a handwritten note, in shaky but clear writing. Asterisk, you shouldn't be here. Leave now. They're watching. Asterisk. I froze. I had no idea who they were. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? Someone left a threatening note in the woods? No names, no details. Just a warning. I never went back to that spot. The feeling of being watched, of not being alone in a place meant for solitude, stuck with me. I kept thinking about that shadow, that silent watcher in the dark, and the warning written on that paper. Weeks later, I found out through a local news report that someone had been arrested for illegal hunting and trespassing in that area. A man who was wanted for several break-ins and thefts in nearby cabins and campsites. The police said he used the woods to hide and stalk victims, waiting until night to approach. They hadn't caught him yet when I was there, but maybe that was the person I saw. The thought chilled me to my core. What saved me that night was probably luck. Luck and the fact that I made noise, let them know I was awake. I like to think that whoever or whatever it was decided I wasn't an easy target. Now, every time I think about going camping, I remember that night. The silence that screamed, the heavy footsteps in the dark, the feeling of eyes watching from shadows. It taught me a simple, brutal truth. Sometimes the scariest things in the wilderness aren't the animals or the weather. Sometimes it's people. People who don't belong, who hide in the dark, waiting. I've learned to respect the forest in a new way, not just for its beauty or peace, but for the hidden dangers that lurk beneath, not in legends or ghosts, but in real life. And sometimes, the best survival skill isn't bravery. It's knowing when to leave. The first thing I remember is the cold biting at my hands. It was early evening when I finally finished setting up my small tent in the middle of the clearing. I had picked this spot because it was near a small stream, and the trees surrounding the area gave a nice bit of shelter from the wind. The sun was already starting to dip below the horizon, turning the sky a soft orange, then pink, and finally a deep blue. I could hear the faint sound of water running nearby, mixed with the rustle of the leaves and occasional chirps of birds getting ready to settle for the night. I wasn't really a camping person. I had only done it a couple of times before, and this was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from everything. No phone, no people, no distractions. Just me, a backpack, a small fire kit, and some food. I told myself I needed it, that sometimes you have to be alone in nature to clear your head. The first night felt peaceful, almost like a breath of fresh air. The fire flickered in front of me, casting long shadows on the trees. I sat on a foldable chair, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos, watching the stars slowly come out. But peace has a way of shifting when you're alone in the woods. I woke up the next morning to a cold breeze slipping through the tent's thin fabric. I unzipped the flap slowly and stepped out. The air smelled fresh and a little damp with dew. Birds were already singing, and the water in the stream gurgled peacefully nearby. I was hungry, so I gathered some dry sticks and started a small fire to boil water for oatmeal. The whole morning passed quietly. I walked along the edge of the stream, took some pictures of the wildflowers and rocks, and felt a strange calm. That was until I noticed something off. At the far end of the clearing, near some thick bushes, I saw tracks in the mud. They were fresh and looked like they belonged to a person. I stared for a while, heart beating a bit faster. The tracks didn't look familiar, and this was supposed to be a quiet spot with hardly anyone around. For a moment, I thought maybe some other campers had been here earlier. I wasn't worried, just curious. The tracks led closer to my tent. That made me pause. I told myself I was overthinking things. Maybe an early morning hiker. Still, I took a mental note to stay alert. That afternoon, I decided to explore a little deeper into the forest, away from the clearing. The woods grew thicker, the trees taller and closer. The sunlight barely reached the ground here, making everything look darker and cooler. I followed a narrow path that twisted between the trees, stepping over roots and fallen branches. The sound of the stream faded behind me. After about an hour, I came to a small hill with a better view. I sat on a rock to rest and looked out over the trees stretching into the distance. The quiet was almost overwhelming. No birds, no insects, just the wind moving the leaves. As I sat there, I noticed a faint smell, like smoke but not from my fire. It was distant but real. I listened carefully and thought I could hear the crackle of a fire in the distance. That's when I realized I might not be alone out here after all. I hurried back to my campsite, moving as quietly as possible, trying not to make too much noise on the dry leaves and twigs. When I got close, I noticed the smell was stronger. Smoke was drifting into my clearing from somewhere nearby. My heart started to pound. I scanned the edges of the trees around my tent but didn't see anyone. Then I spotted it. A small campfire smoldering just beyond the bushes, maybe 50 yards away. The fire wasn't big, and the embers glowed softly, but there was no one around it. No tents, no chairs, no backpacks. Felt like someone had just left. But who and why? I stood there frozen for a moment, weighing what to do. Part of me wanted to leave right away and get back to my car, but another part was curious. I decided to circle the area quietly and see if I could find any other signs. Maybe someone was nearby. As I moved closer, I noticed footprints around the fire, fresh and deep, like someone wearing boots. There were also some empty food wrappers and a crushed soda can. Whoever had been here hadn't been long gone. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't want to stick around, but I couldn't just walk away either. I grabbed a small branch and poked at the fire embers to see if there was anything underneath. That's when I saw it. A small piece of paper caught in the ash. I picked it up carefully. It was a torn page from some kind of notebook. Written in hurried handwriting were numbers, like a phone number or maybe coordinates, and a few words that didn't make sense right away. I put the paper in my pocket and decided I should get back to my tent. I needed to think, to figure out what this could mean. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise outside the tent made me jump. The wind rustling through the trees sounded like footsteps. The occasional snap of a twig made me freeze in place. I kept my small knife close and my flashlight within reach. I wanted to convince myself I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint crunching sound near the edge of the clearing. Someone was walking slowly, deliberately, through the leaves and dirt. I held my breath and stayed as still as possible. The sound stopped, then started again, moving closer. I could see the shadows shifting outside the tent's thin fabric. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I gripped the knife tighter and reached for my flashlight. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped again. Silence. I didn't move for what felt like hours. The next morning, I packed up quickly. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. followed even. I wanted to leave but was also determined to figure out what that strange paper meant. I sat by the stream, pulled out the note, and stared at the scribbles. The numbers looked like GPS coordinates. I entered them into my phone's map app. I had turned the data off but still had offline maps. The location was a few miles deeper into the forest, near an old abandoned logging site I had heard about but never visited. Against better judgment, I decided to check it out before leaving. I followed the trail the coordinates led me on, weaving between trees, crossing small creeks, and climbing over fallen logs. The forest grew darker and quieter. The path was faint, overgrown in some places. After about an hour, I came to a clearing unlike the one where I had camped. This one was larger, with broken wooden beams and rusted metal scraps scattered around. The remains of what used to be a small logging shack lay half-collapsed near the center. The smell of old wood and rust filled the air. I started walking through the rubble when I spotted something strange. Fresh footprints in the dirt, leading away from the shack into the thicker forest. They looked like the same boot prints I had seen near my campfire. I paused, feeling a mix of fear and curiosity. Following the footprints, I moved deeper into the woods. The trees here were old, huge trunks covered in moss. The light filtered in thinly, making everything look shadowy. The footprints led me toward a small hill. As I climbed, I noticed more signs: broken branches, crushed plants, like someone was moving quickly through here. At the top, I found something unexpected. A small clearing with an old hunting blind, made from camo netting and branches. It looked recently used. I could see fresh droppings and some empty cans nearby. I realized this was a place someone was hiding or watching from. Suddenly, a rustle came from the bushes behind me. I whipped around but saw nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt trapped. I didn't want to be here anymore. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I took out my phone and tried calling for help, but no signal. I was completely alone. That's when I heard voices. Not loud, but low, talking nearby, maybe 50 yards away. I froze and listened carefully. I couldn't make out words, but I could tell there were at least two people. My heart was racing. I didn't want to be found. Whoever was here seemed dangerous. I quickly moved down the hill and back toward the old shack, trying to be as quiet as possible. As I neared the shack, I heard footsteps behind me. Fast, heavy steps breaking branches. I broke into a run, stumbling over roots and rocks, heart pounding in my ears. I could hear them gaining on me. I darted toward the stream, thinking maybe I could lose them by crossing the water and hiding on the other side. The cold water shocked my legs as I plunged in, but I didn't stop. I scrambled up the opposite bank and ran into the thick trees, branches whipping my face and arms. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was out of breath and the footsteps faded away. I kept running until I found a dirt road, thankfully still inside the forest but close enough to civilization. I spotted a parked car a few hundred yards down. I ran toward it and saw a man sitting inside, reading a newspaper. I banged on the window until he noticed me. He looked startled but unlocked the door. I got in and told him about what had happened as best as I could without words. He nodded and said he would call the police. Later, at the police station, I gave a full report. The officers told me that the area was known for some illegal activity. I had always liked being out in nature. The stillness, the sounds of wind moving through the trees, the smell of pine and soil, even the way your clothes cling to your body after a long hike. I found peace in it. I wasn't new to camping. I wasn't an expert either, but I had done enough weekend trips to know how to build a fire, pitch a tent, and follow basic survival rules. So when I got a few days off work and needed to get away from everything, my phone, the city people, I decided to head out alone. That's how this all started. I picked a spot far from any campground or ranger station. It was deep inside a forested area I had read about in an online hiking forum. A user had posted some GPS coordinates, praising the solitude and how rarely anyone went out there. I checked maps, did some research, and packed up the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, knife, flashlight, first aid kit, extra clothes, and even a basic satellite beacon just in case. I told my brother where I was going. That was my only precaution. After that, I drove out early in the morning and parked off a logging road, then hiked in for almost 4 hours until I found a flat spot near a stream. It was perfect. No signs of anyone, no trash, no old campfires, nothing. I set up camp and started to settle in. That first evening was quiet. I heard owls somewhere in the trees. The wind picked up a little after sunset, and the temperature dropped fast. I sat near the fire and ate a couple of energy bars, then crawled into my tent and lay in the dark, letting the quiet wash over me. But something felt different the next day. It was subtle, just a gut feeling that something wasn't right. I woke up early and unzipped the tent. The air felt colder than it should have, and the trees looked darker, like they were leaning just a little more than yesterday. The stream nearby was moving fast and loud, and something about the noise irritated me. I told myself I was just adjusting to the silence and lack of distractions, but that feeling didn't go away. It got worse as the day went on. I spent the morning walking around the area, collecting dry wood and just exploring. The sun was out, but everything still felt dim. Around noon, I found what looked like a trail. Not a real one, more like a faint path someone had walked before. It was narrow and overgrown, but had clear footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. I checked my boots against them. The ones I found were larger and deeper, like whoever made them was heavier than me and wearing thicker-soled boots. They looked fresh. I followed them a bit, but stopped after maybe 20 minutes. Something about it felt off. They weaved in and out of the trees, sometimes vanishing into rocks or brush, then appearing again on patches of soft soil. It almost felt like someone was trying not to be followed but wasn't very good at it. I stood still for a while, listening. Nothing. No birds. No wind. No water. Just silence. That silence made the hair on my arms stand up. I turned around and walked straight back to camp, trying not to look over my shoulder. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing things. Little snapping noises in the woods, like twigs breaking underfoot. At first, I thought it was animals, but the sounds were too heavy. They came in patterns, 3 steps, then silence. 5 steps, then a pause. Too steady for animals. I lay in my tent with my knife in my hand and the flashlight beside me, holding my breath. I kept waiting to hear someone call out or cough or step too close, but nothing ever came close enough. The sounds circled my camp all night, far enough to stay hidden, but close enough that I knew I wasn't imagining them. By morning, I was exhausted. I told myself I'd leave after breakfast. I packed some gear, poured out cold instant coffee, and decided to take down the tent. But then I saw something that stopped me cold. Footprints. Not mine. Not from the trail the day before. These were right outside my tent, maybe 3 feet from where I had been sleeping. They led from the tree line to the back of my tent, then circled around and stopped behind a log about 10 feet away. They weren't there the day before. I would have seen them. The dirt was soft and damp from morning dew, and the prints were crisp and deep, like whoever made them was standing there for a while, watching. That was it for me. I packed everything as fast as I could, threw things into my pack without folding or sorting. Fire still smoldering, trash not buried properly. I didn't care. I just needed to leave. I grabbed my GPS and started hiking back toward the car, checking the device every few minutes to make sure I was on track. The forest looked different again. Everything felt tighter, closer, like the trees were closing in, like the air was getting heavier the farther I walked. About 2 hours into the hike, I started hearing the snapping again. Branches breaking, leaves rustling. I told myself it was squirrels or deer, but it wasn't. I moved faster, nearly jogging at times, heart racing, mouth dry. I stopped once to drink from my water bottle, and as I stood still, I heard a cough. A dry, sharp sound maybe 50 feet behind me. I didn't look back. I just started walking again. Not running, but fast and steady. The sun was higher now, but I couldn't feel it. The trail was mostly shaded, and the canopy above blocked most of the light. I finally saw the edge of the logging road ahead and felt a rush of relief. I could see my car, the dull shine of metal behind some brush. I was almost there. Then I saw something that stopped me again. Another set of footprints. These weren't mine either. They led from the opposite direction, out of the woods and directly toward my car. The driver's side door was slightly open. I knew I locked it. I dropped my pack, crouched behind a fallen tree, and waited. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I stared at the car for almost 15 minutes. No one came out, no movement, no sound. Finally, I crept up slowly, knife in one hand, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. The door was wide open now. There was mud on the seat, heavy, wet footprints on the floor mat. The glove compartment was open, and my papers were scattered. Whoever it was had gone through everything. They had opened the trunk too. My extra gear was gone, even the first aid kit, but they weren't there anymore. I slammed the door, locked it again, and started the engine. Turned over like nothing was wrong, like none of this had happened. I reversed out, turned onto the road, and drove straight back to the highway, speeding the whole way, glancing in the mirror over and over again. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station an hour away. I got out and checked the car. Nothing else was missing, just the gear. No scratches, no signs of anyone. But I knew someone had been out there with me. I had no proof, just those prints, the sounds, the feeling of being watched. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone. I said the trip was fine. I unpacked everything, checked my gear. Some of the food was gone too. My extra flashlight, a small hatchet, the matches. All of it was stuff someone could use if they were living out there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed thinking about those prints, the way they circled the tent, the way they stopped. How long had that person stood there just watching? Why didn't they do anything? What were they waiting for? Days passed. I kept replaying it all in my head. Couldn't stop. So I went back online, back to that same hiking forum, looking for the original post about the GPS coordinates. I wanted to see if anyone else had been there. Maybe someone else had a similar experience. But the post was gone. No username, no trace, like it had never been there. I scrolled through thread after thread, but nothing came up. I started to think maybe I had copied the coordinates wrong or misremembered, but I still had them saved in my notes. I checked again. They were there exactly the same. I tried searching the area on social media, local news, anything that might say something about strange activity in that forest. Nothing. No missing people. No crime reports. Nothing out of the ordinary. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Someone was out there. Someone was watching. Someone who didn't want to be found. Maybe they were living off the grid. Maybe they were dangerous. Maybe they were just curious. But whoever they were, they had been close. Too close. Close enough to touch the tent. Close enough to get into my car. Close enough that I still feel them in the back of my mind. I haven't gone camping since. I don't think I ever will again. Not alone. Not after that. I had always found comfort in being alone in the woods. The deeper I hiked, the better I felt. It wasn't about escaping people. I didn't hate people. It was just something about the stillness of the trees, the lack of noise except for natural sounds, the hard rhythm of hiking all day with nothing but my pack on my back. I could think clearly. I could breathe. I didn't have to be anything or anyone. I was just a guy moving forward through trees, rocks, mud, and sun. I had taken 2 weeks off from work. I planned to camp and hike solo through a long, barely trafficked stretch of state forest that connected to national forest land, somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, but far from the popular routes. I had studied the maps for weeks and printed backups. No cell coverage out there. I packed a satellite beacon, food for 12 days, water filter, bear spray, flare gun, a hatchet, a fixed blade, fire starter, the works. I wasn't a survivalist or a doomsday guy, just methodical, cautious. I parked my truck at a small trailhead with a weather-beaten sign. It looked like no one had touched it in months. Perfect. I hiked in 5 miles the first day, set up camp near a creek. The night came early and deep. I made a small fire, heated up some stew in a tin, watched the stars blink between the pines, slept like a stone. For the next 5 days, it went just like that. Morning mist in the hollow's wind through dry needles. The smell of earth. I saw 2 deer, a bobcat, dozens of birds I couldn't name, and no people at all. That was the goal. No one. On the 6th day, I reached a ridge that dipped down into a new area of the forest I hadn't explored before. The terrain got steeper, and the trail was overgrown, barely visible in places. On the map, the old Forest Service lines crisscrossed it like veins, but out here, the ground was taking it back. At one point, I had to bushwhack a 1/4 mile around a downed pine that looked like it had crashed decades ago. Around late afternoon, I found a clearing and decided to set up camp. The ground was flat and dry, ringed with thick ferns and mossy stumps. The silence was deep here, too deep. No birdsong, no wind, just a flat kind of stillness that pressed in around me. I chalked it up to normal forest variation. Some areas are like that. Maybe it was a predator in the area. Cougars, maybe. I kept my bear spray close and built a fire early. While boiling water for my dehydrated meal, I decided to take a short walk up a slope behind my camp to get a view of the terrain. It was steep and slick with dead leaves. About 50 feet up, I reached a break in the trees where I could see across the valley. Trees in every direction. Nothing but endless green and gray. But something caught my eye off to the left, an odd dark shape halfway down the slope of the next ridge over. It looked rectangular, man-made, maybe a shed or a hunting blind. It was miles off. I pulled out my small monocular and steadied it. Through the lens, I could make out a square building with a slanted tin roof, mostly hidden by trees. No windows, no markings, just a dark, squat structure tucked in deep. That wasn't on any map I had. I stayed up late that night, staring into the fire, listening. Nothing came. The air was still, no wind at all. Even the fire crackled quietly like it didn't want to wake the woods. I felt a nagging sensation that I shouldn't go near that building, that I should move on in the morning, maybe take a wide detour around the ridge. But then again, it was probably some old ranger shack or maybe a hunting cabin. I come this far. I was curious. The next morning, I packed light, just water, my knife, a snack, and my small camera. I left my tent and gear hidden under a camo tarp. I marked the spot carefully on my GPS and made sure to take a compass bearing. The hike toward the structure was rough. I had to climb down one ravine and up another, slogging through wet brush, ducking under logs, getting soaked with dew and scratched by brambles. It took almost 3 hours to reach the area where I thought the building was. As I got closer, something felt off. The trees were denser here, but it wasn't just that. It was the smell, a faint metallic scent, mixed with rot. It reminded me of an old junkyard I used to pass by on my bike as a kid. Rust, oil, and something dead. When I finally saw the building up close, I stopped cold. It wasn't a cabin. It wasn't a shack. It looked more like a container, like someone had buried a small shipping container into the earth and built a sloped tin roof over the front. There was a heavy steel door, no windows, and no markings at all. The lock was rusted but intact. The door was closed. No sign of life. No path leading to it. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. I didn't want to get closer, but I did. My legs moved without really asking me first. The ground around it was bare, packed dirt with no grass or moss, like someone had cleared it not too long ago. I circled once, careful not to make noise. On the far side, I found a pile of black trash bags, torn open, half-rotted. Flies buzzing lazily. I didn't want to look. I looked anyway. They were full of clothes, torn clothes, dirty, soaked, stiff with old blood. Not animal blood. I've hunted before. I know the difference. I backed away fast. My stomach twisted, and my heart started hammering. This was wrong. All wrong. I turned to leave, and then I heard something move inside the container. Just one sound, a single thump. Not metal on metal. Not pipes. It sounded like someone pressing against the inside of the wall. Just once. I froze. Everything in my body said run. But I didn't want to make noise. I backed away slowly, watching the door. No movement. No more sounds. It took me over 4 hours to get back to my camp. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way. Every broken twig or squirrel in the brush made me flinch. When I finally got back, my tarp had been pulled halfway off the tent. Nothing stolen, nothing touched, really, just like someone had looked through it. Maybe just wind, I told myself, but I packed up fast and moved out. I hiked late into the night, using my headlamp until the batteries died. Then I used my backup light. I camped hastily off the trail, not even bothering with a fire. I didn't sleep. Every sound felt like footsteps. I kept my knife in my hand, lying still in my bag with my eyes open to the dark. By morning, I was exhausted and jumpy. I decided to head back toward the trailhead. I was 2 days away if I pushed it. I hiked hard, barely stopping. Around midday, I started to hear something behind me. Faint but there. Branches cracking. Not consistent. Just now and then, but too often to be random. I would stop, listen, wait. Nothing. Then I'd go on. Then it would happen again. By late afternoon, I was sure someone was following me. I didn't run. That would have been stupid. But I changed course. I climbed up a ridge and doubled back a short distance off trail, then waited. I lay flat behind a log and watched the slope below. 20 minutes passed. Then I saw him. A man, maybe in his 40s. Thin, dirty clothes. He didn't have a pack. No gear. Just a long coat, stained and ragged. He moved quietly, looking side to side, like he was tracking, like he was hunting. He passed less than 50 feet from me, never looking up. He had something in his hand. Couldn't see what. I stayed there for hours after he passed. When I finally moved again, I went in a completely different direction. I climbed through thorny ravines over ridges, far off any marked trail. I made it to an old logging road by nightfall. I followed it for hours, hoping it led somewhere. Around 2 a.m., I saw lights. Not headlights, flashlights. 2 of them scanning the woods ahead. I almost shouted for help, but something stopped me. I crouched low behind a stump and watched. The men moved slowly, methodically. They weren't calling out. They weren't searching for someone lost. They looked like they knew exactly where they were going. One of them had a radio. He spoke into it quietly, and the other pointed ahead. They headed into the trees, moving toward the direction I had come from. I waited until I couldn't see the lights anymore, then ran the opposite way. I didn't stop until morning. By the next evening, I reached a ranger station. I lied and said I'd gotten lost and needed help. I didn't tell them about the container. I didn't tell them about the man who followed me. I just wanted to get out of there. The ranger gave me a ride back to my truck. I left the forest that night and never went back. Later, I tried to find the building on satellite maps. I looked at every inch of that ridge, every shadow. Nothing. I even reported a vague, suspicious structure to a forest tip line, anonymously. Nothing ever came of it. I don't know who those men were or what was in that container. But I know what I saw, and I know how quiet the woods got that day, how empty and dead the air felt. I've done dozens of hikes since then, but I never go off trail anymore. I never camp alone more than a day's hike from my... The sun was already dipping behind the tall pines when I finally reached the small clearing I had chosen for my solo camping trip. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen branches and dry leaves, but it was far enough off the trail to guarantee some privacy. I'd been craving a break from the constant noise of the city. Just me, the quiet, and the forest. I carried my backpack, heavy with the essentials. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a small first aid kit. I wanted to be prepared, but I also wanted to keep things simple. Setting up the tent took longer than I expected. The poles were stubborn, and the ground was hard. The sun was nearly gone when I finally had the tent up and the sleeping bag rolled out inside. The air was crisp, with that earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil that only a forest can have. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, feeling the chill creep in as the shadows grew deeper. I'd planned to build a small campfire, so I gathered dry twigs and branches from around the clearing. It was quiet except for the occasional snap of a twig underfoot and the distant rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. No animals in sight, but the forest always feels alive, like something's watching, even when you know it's just the wind or an owl out hunting. When the fire finally caught, the orange flames danced against the darkening sky. I sat close to it, warming my hands, the light casting flickering shadows on the trees. I opened my pack, took out a small can of beans, and heated them over the fire. Simple food, but enough to settle my stomach. The crackle of the fire mixed with the quiet hum of night insects. As the fire burned low, I leaned back against a fallen log and looked up through the tree branches at the sky. The stars were bright, clearer than I'd seen in years. No city lights to dull their shine here. It was peaceful, maybe too peaceful. That's when I first noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like something burning, but not the kind of fire I was used to. It was acrid, sharp, like plastic or rubber, something synthetic. I looked around, but all I saw was the fire's glow and the black outlines of trees. No smoke drifting anywhere. The smell lingered, and I felt uneasy. I checked my fire again. No sign it was burning anything other than wood. Then I heard it, a sound like scraping, soft at first, almost like the wind dragging branches across rocks, but more deliberate, closer. I stood up, gripping my flashlight tightly. The beam cut through the dark, sweeping over trees and rocks. Nothing. No movement, no animals. I told myself it was just the forest settling for the night. Trees move, branches fall. But the scraping sound came again, this time from the edge of the clearing, near the thick brush. My heart rate picked up. I didn't have any reason to be afraid. I was miles from the nearest road. No one else should be around. But something wasn't right. I grabbed my small pocket knife from my belt, just in case. The forest was alive with noise now. Birds calling far off, the wind in the trees, the crackling fire. Yet that scraping sound kept coming, slow and steady, like someone dragging something heavy over rocks. I scanned the edge of the clearing with my flashlight, focusing on the thick bushes. Suddenly, the light caught a flash of movement, a dark shape slipping between the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a large bird, but the way it moved didn't feel natural. It was slow, careful, almost watching me. My skin prickled. The cold in the air didn't help. I considered packing up and leaving right then, but I told myself it was just nerves. Maybe a raccoon or a fox looking for food. I went back to my fire, poking at the ashes with a stick to keep it alive. The smell was stronger now, that burning plastic smell, mixed with something else, something metallic. My stomach turned. Suddenly, the fire flickered violently. The wind had picked up, or something was near. The scraping noise was louder, right at the edge of the clearing now. I held my flashlight steady, shining it toward the noise. The beam illuminated the rough bark of the trees, the thick underbrush, but no sign of whatever had moved. I stepped closer to the edge, trying to get a better look. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled forward, dropping the flashlight. The beam spun wildly, finally landing on something that made my blood run cold. There, partially hidden under leaves and broken branches, was a backpack. A large, heavy-looking pack, worn and dirty. It wasn't mine. I hadn't seen it on the trail when I came in. The scraping stopped. I crouched, heart pounding, and inspected the pack. It was zipped shut, but the material was torn in places. I carefully unzipped it and peeked inside. Inside were tools, knives, ropes, cans of food, bottles of water, and something else. Papers. Maps, I guess, but folded and crumpled like they'd been stuffed in a hurry. Some looked like official documents with stamps and signatures. I didn't want to touch anything more than necessary. The forest suddenly felt suffocating, like the trees themselves were closing in. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around the clearing again. No one, but I could feel eyes watching me. I closed the pack and backed away slowly, heading toward my tent. I debated whether to stay or leave. The fire was almost out. I had a cell phone, but the signal was weak out here. Maybe I could call for help if I got closer to the trail. Then I heard it again, that scraping. But this time it was coming from all around me, soft, slow, like someone dragging something heavy on the ground. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my pack and ran toward the tent, fumbling to unzip it and throw myself inside. I zipped the flap shut behind me and sat there, breathing hard, listening. Outside, the noises stopped. Minutes passed. The fire was cold. The forest was silent except for the normal sounds of night insects. I wanted to convince myself it was over, that I was safe. But I wasn't. Suddenly, a new sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching leaves. Not one set, but multiple. Circling the clearing, moving closer. I gripped my knife tight. My mind raced. I thought about running, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen. Then I heard it, the soft snap of a branch breaking close to the tent. I scrambled out, flashlight in hand, shining it wildly. There was nothing there, no sign of anyone, but the backpack was gone. The smell was back now, stronger and sickening. That burning plastic mixed with something metallic and sharp. I started running back toward the trail. Branches whipped at my face. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. I didn't look back. The trail was a faint line in the dark, but I knew it. I stumbled and fell a few times, but I kept going. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only maybe 30 minutes, I reached the edge of the woods. The lights of a highway in the distance. I could see cars driving, hear their engines. I pulled out my phone and called 911. The police came, but by the time they searched the clearing, there was no sign of anyone or anything. No footprints except mine. No backpack. No smell. I told them everything. The scratching, the backpack, the smell. They suggested it might have been people living illegally in the woods, maybe scavengers or vandals, but they never found anyone. I never went back to that forest. I still don't know what I saw or smelled that night, but I do know one thing. Some places are better left alone, and when something doesn't feel right, it's not just your imagination. It's a warning. I still have the memory of the backpack, the smell, and the sounds. And every time I camp now, even in a crowded campground, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Camping should be peaceful, but sometimes the forest hides things that don't want to be found. And if you stumble on them, it can change everything. The sun was dipping low behind the tall pine trees when I pulled off the main road onto the narrow dirt path leading into the forest. The air smelled fresh with pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that always made me feel alive. I was alone with only my backpack, a tent, and the essentials I'd packed for a weekend camping trip. No cell service, no distractions, just me and the woods. I've been looking forward to this for weeks. The city noise, the constant buzz of work and people, it all wore me down. Out here, with the quiet, I hoped to clear my head, maybe even sleep under the stars without the hum of cars or sirens in the background. It was late afternoon when I finally found the clearing I'd scouted on the map. A small flat area surrounded by tall pines and a few birch trees. There was a slow-moving creek nearby, its water catching the fading light. I got out of my car, the gravel crunching under my boots, and started unloading. Pitching the tent took longer than I remembered. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but eventually the tent stood firm. I stacked some wood in a small pile, hoping to build a fire later when the night fully set in. The forest was peaceful as I walked around, taking in the sounds of birds settling down for the night and the soft rustling of leaves. The creek gurgled softly nearby. It felt good to be away from everything. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly, feeling my shoulders relax. I gathered some dry sticks and twigs, enough to start a small fire. The sun had almost disappeared, but there was still enough light to work. Using my lighter, I finally got a small flame going. The fire slowly caught, flickering orange and yellow, warming my hands as the temperature dropped. I set a pot of water on a small makeshift stand and waited for it to boil. As twilight deepened into night, the woods around me became darker and more alive in a different way. The sounds changed. The birds were silent now, replaced by crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere deep in the trees. The fire crackled softly. After eating some canned beans warmed over the fire and drinking the water I'd boiled, I leaned back against a log, watching the flames dance. My eyes grew heavy. I figured I'd head into the tent soon, zip up, and get some rest. Tomorrow, I'd hike the trails I'd marked and maybe try fishing in the creek. That's when I first noticed it. A soft crunch of twigs just beyond the firelight caught my attention. I froze, straining my ears. The sound wasn't like any animal I'd heard before. Not a squirrel or raccoon, not a deer or a rabbit. It was heavier, deliberate, like footsteps. I scanned the darkness beyond the circle of firelight but saw nothing. I told myself it was probably a deer or a stray animal wandering through. The woods were full of them. Still, the sound came again, crunch, crunch, slow and steady, moving closer but staying just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. I didn't speak or move. My heart beat a little faster, but I told myself to stay calm. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed the beam into the woods. The light caught on a shadow, but it moved quickly behind a tree. I dropped the light back to the fire and tried to think. Could it be another camper? I was supposed to be alone in this area, but maybe someone else had wandered in. Or a hunter. The season was right for it. Hunters usually wore bright orange, though, and I didn't see any reflective patches. I kept my knife close, just in case, and kept watch. The fire was low now, but I added more wood to keep the circle of light alive. Every time the fire flickered, the shadows seemed to shift. The footsteps came and went, always stopping just out of the light's reach. After what felt like an hour, the noises stopped. The woods fell silent again. My pulse slowed, and I debated whether to crawl into my tent or stay awake by the fire. I decided to stay up a bit longer, wanting to be sure. About an hour after that, I thought I heard something else. This time a faint tapping, like someone lightly knocking on a tree trunk. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to break my concentration. I sat very still, scanning the darkness. Nothing moved. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a bird or a woodpecker out of its normal time. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I was suddenly very aware of how alone I was. The forest was beautiful, but it felt hostile in a way I hadn't expected. When the fire was nearly out, I picked up the pot and carried it into the tent, letting the last embers glow faintly behind me. I zipped the tent door tight and sat in the dark, my small flashlight on low beam beside me. The tent felt too small and fragile out here. I knew I had to get some sleep. I told myself to relax, breathe slow, and rest. But I didn't sleep well. Throughout the night, every little sound made me jump. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an animal. At one point, I thought I heard a whisper, but I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or my imagination. I stayed awake half the night, tense and alert. Just before dawn, the noises stopped, and the forest was quiet again. I stepped out of the tent to see the first light creeping through the trees. The air was cold and fresh. I looked around the clearing carefully. Nothing unusual, no tracks except the ones I'd made. I packed up quickly, eager to leave the place. The whole time, I kept glancing into the woods, half expecting to see a figure standing just beyond the trees, watching me. When I got back in my car, I took a deep breath, started the engine, and drove out of the forest, feeling the tension in my body slowly ease. Looking back, I realized the forest itself hadn't been dangerous. No animals, no people nearby, but the unknown presence, the footsteps just beyond the firelight, the tapping on the tree, it was enough to make me feel small and vulnerable. Sometimes, being alone in the wild means facing not just the physical world, but your own fears. The feeling that someone or something might be just outside your sight, watching, waiting. That day, I learned that fear doesn't need monsters or ghosts. It just needs the unknown, and sometimes that's enough. It was supposed to be a short, peaceful solo camping trip. Nothing big, just a weekend to reset my head, breathe cleaner air, and get away from the same four walls I had been sitting inside for months. I picked a small area deep in the woods of northern Washington. Dense pine forests, not many campers, and just remote enough that I could feel like I'd disappeared from the world for a while. I had done trips like this before, maybe not completely alone each time, but I was no stranger to the woods. I'd learned the basics of survival, carried the right gear, and never got careless. I planned things down to the hour. Packed light but smart tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, camping stove, water filter, extra clothes, a knife, a flare gun, compass, topo map, backup battery for my phone, and my old reliable hiking boots. I even printed a copy of my trail route and left it with my brother in case something went wrong. The plan was to hike up a loop trail I'd found on a forum. Nothing official, just something local hikers had mapped out. It started at a pull-off on an old logging road and snaked up through thick woods, climbing slowly until it reached a small lake a few miles in. That was where I would set up camp for the night before looping back the next day. It was already late afternoon by the time I parked. The sun was low but not in a threatening way. Just that soft golden light through the trees that makes everything look calmer than it actually is. I grabbed my pack, double-checked the car was locked, and started down the trail. First, everything felt perfect. The trees were tall and straight, the ground was dry and firm, and the forest was alive with quiet, subtle sounds. Wind moving through the canopy, birds calling to each other in the distance. I could feel my breathing slow down as I walked. It felt good to be away from people, from noise, from screens and signals. Just walking, just listening to the rhythm of my own steps on the pine needles. After a couple hours of steady hiking, I reached the lake. It wasn't huge, maybe the size of a football field, surrounded by thick forest and rocky outcroppings. The water was so still it looked like glass. I dropped my pack, stretched my legs, and set up camp a little ways back from the shore where the ground was flat. I cooked a quick meal, freeze-dried rice and beans with a cup of instant coffee, and sat for a while just watching the sun go down. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. It was peaceful out there, and a fire would have felt like shouting into silence. I crawled into my tent as the sky turned purple and the stars came out, zipped up the flap, and let myself drift off with the sound of crickets chirping outside. I woke up sometime in the night, not to a sound, really more like a feeling. You know how sometimes your body just knows something's wrong before your brain catches up? That kind of feeling. I lay there, totally still, listening. I couldn't hear anything out of the ordinary. No footsteps, no branches breaking, just the same quiet forest noises. But I couldn't shake the unease. I stayed awake for a while, eyes wide open in the dark, ears straining. I told myself I was being paranoid, just nerves, maybe a dream I didn't remember that spooked me. Eventually I fell back asleep, but the rest of the night was restless. The next morning, I packed up and started back toward the trailhead. My plan was to get back to the car by early afternoon and head home before dark. But a few hours into the hike, I came to a fork in the trail I didn't remember. That threw me off. I pulled out the map, but it didn't show a split there. The main trail was supposed to loop, not branch like this. I walked back and forth along the path, checking for markings. Nothing. No signs, no ribbons tied to trees like you sometimes see on unofficial trails. Just a narrow, beaten path that curved off to the right, almost hidden by undergrowth. I should have turned around and stuck to the route I knew. I knew better, but I'd always had a stubborn streak when it came to directions, and I was sure I hadn't taken a wrong turn. So I figured the new path might be a shortcut, a newer trail someone had cleared recently. Started out fine, a little overgrown but not hard to follow. The deeper I went, though, the narrower and darker it got. The trees closed in tighter, blocking more light. Felt colder, too. I kept expecting it to reconnect with the main trail, but after another hour of walking, it was clear it wasn't going to. I checked the map again. Nothing matched what I was seeing. Worse, the GPS on my phone wasn't working. No signal, not even a hint of service. I tried the compass, north still worked, but that didn't help much without knowing where the trail actually was. I realized I'd been heading downhill for a while, too far downhill. The main trail didn't dip this low, and that's when it hit me. I'd wandered off the loop completely. I wasn't on the trail anymore. I was in deep forest, alone, with no clue how far I was from the path. Still, I didn't panic. I trained for stuff like this. I marked a spot with bright orange tape from my pack and decided to backtrack. But the weirdest thing happened. I couldn't find the spot I'd entered from. I knew I hadn't turned around or gotten disoriented. but the trail just disappeared behind me. The way I'd come looked like nothing more than trees and brush. No beaten path, no footprints, no broken twigs, like it had sealed itself off. I circled the area a few times, searching for any signs, but it was no use. It all looked the same. That was the first time I felt real fear. Not just unease, but that cold sweat, pounding heart kind of fear. I had the gear to survive a few days if I had to, but the thought of being completely lost out here wasn't something I'd prepared for mentally. I kept moving downhill, thinking maybe I'd hit a stream or a road eventually. That's usually the best bet when you're lost. Follow water, follow valleys. But what I found instead was something I hadn't expected at all. An old structure hidden among the trees. At first, I thought it was a shack, just a weathered wall through the branches. But when I got closer, I saw it was much bigger. Not quite a cabin, not quite a house. Just a long, low wooden building, covered in moss and half sunk into the earth. No windows I could see, no sign of people, no trails leading to or from it. It looked abandoned, totally lifeless, but somehow wrong, like it shouldn't be there, like the forest had been trying to bury it. I stood there for a long time, debating what to do. Part of me wanted to go inside just to check for supplies or maybe a map, maybe something left behind by hunters or loggers. But another part of me, the smarter part, knew this was a terrible idea. Still, I was tired, and I didn't want to spend another night in the woods if I didn't have to. So I walked up to the door. It was slightly open, hanging crooked on one hinge. I pushed it gently, and it creaked inward. Inside, it was dark. The air smelled like rot and wet wood. The floor sagged in places. Old furniture, broken chairs, shattered glass, and some torn tarps lay scattered around. Everything was damp, soft from years of moisture and neglect. I stepped in slowly, every board groaning under my weight. I kept one hand on my knife. There was an old fireplace at the far end, blackened with soot, a rusty stove in the corner, shelves with jars of God knows what. It looked like no one had been there in years. But then I saw something that stopped me cold. In the corner, half hidden under a ripped canvas sheet, was a backpack. Modern, clean, not like the rest of the place. I crouched and pulled the canvas away. The pack was a high-end hiking brand. Not new, but definitely not from the same era as this building. I opened the main pocket. Inside were clothes, a flashlight, some trail mix, a phone with a cracked screen, and a notebook. The pages were weathered, but I could still read most of it. It was a log, dates, times, short entries. The first few were normal, descriptions of hiking, scenery, food. Then they started to change. The tone got weird, paranoid. Things like, I heard footsteps outside, or something's wrong with the woods, and I tried to leave but the path is gone. The last entry chilled me. There's someone out there, watching me. Every time I move, I hear them. I'm not alone. I stood up fast, heart pounding. I shoved the notebook back into the bag and turned to leave. But I wasn't alone. Outside the door, not 30 feet from the entrance, stood a man. He was dirty, thin, shirtless despite the cold. He had something in his hand. I couldn't see what, just stood there watching me. I backed up into the cabin slowly. He didn't move. He just stood there, head tilted slightly like he was trying to figure something out. I slammed the door, jammed a broken chair under the handle, and scrambled out the back window. I hit the ground hard and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran until my legs gave out, then crawled behind a fallen log and laid there, holding my breath. The forest was silent again, too silent. I didn't hear him following, but I knew he was out there. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't eat. I just waited for daylight. When the sun came up, I climbed a ridge trying to get my bearings. After hours of hiking blindly, it was late spring when I decided to go camping alone for the first time in years. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, the constant buzzing of life, and just spend some time with nature. I picked a random spot in a national forest, about 3 hours from my home. The area was known for its dense woods, a small river, and some trails that weren't heavily traveled. I figured the isolation would be good. Just me, the trees, and the sounds of the forest. I packed my gear carefully. A small tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for 3 days, a lighter, some matches, a small first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a pocket knife. I left my phone on silent and off, wanting to fully disconnect. The drive there was peaceful. The road narrowed as I went deeper into the forest, and I could see the sun setting behind tall pine trees casting long shadows. By the time I reached the spot I had picked, the sun was almost gone. The sky was painted with dark blue and orange hues. I parked my car on a small dirt clearing and unloaded my gear. The spot was surrounded by tall trees, a mix of pines and oaks, and the ground was covered in dry leaves and twigs. A small river ran nearby, its water barely visible but the sound clear enough. A soothing rush. I set up my tent quickly. The fabric felt rough and a bit cold as I zipped it up. The first night passed without incident. The forest noises were loud but familiar. Owls calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling in the wind. The air was cool and smelled of pine and wet earth. I slept in my sleeping bag, cozy but alert to every noise, like I always am in unfamiliar places. The next morning, I woke early, feeling refreshed but cautious. I started a small fire to make coffee, the smoke drifting upwards in the still air. The sun filtered through the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow. I spent the day hiking some of the trails nearby. The forest was beautiful. Bright green leaves, wildflowers, and small birds flitting from branch to branch. I was careful to stay hydrated and took note of landmarks in case I needed to find my way back. Late afternoon, I returned to camp and prepared some simple food. Canned beans heated over the fire, crackers, and a little cheese. I sat on a log, enjoying the silence, except for the river's constant murmur and the occasional bird call. I felt peaceful, almost disconnected from the world beyond these trees. Then, as evening approached, things started to feel off. At first, it was just a faint noise, something scratching or rustling in the underbrush. It wasn't loud, but enough to catch my attention. I stopped what I was doing and listened carefully. The forest was quiet otherwise. No wind, no animals moving around. I shrugged it off, thinking it might be a small animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel. I went to get some water from the river before it got dark. The path was uneven and slippery from moss and fallen leaves. The river was shallow here, with clear water flowing over smooth rocks. As I bent down to fill my bottle, I noticed something strange. A trail of footprints in the mud along the bank, leading toward my camp. The prints were large and didn't look like any animal I knew. They were human, no doubt about it. I felt a chill, even though the air was warm. I stood up and looked around. No one was in sight. The forest seemed to be holding its breath. I thought about shouting or making noise, but there was no one to shout to. I walked quickly back to my tent, keeping my eyes peeled. That night, I made sure the fire was large and bright. I arranged my knife within easy reach and double-checked my tent zippers. I lay awake for hours, listening to every sound. The scratching noise came again, closer this time. Something moved just beyond the firelight, in the shadows of the trees. My heart pounded hard. I told myself to stay calm, to think logically. Could be a wild animal curious about the fire or food. But then, I saw movement. A flash of a dark shape moving quickly between the trees. It was too big for a deer or coyote. It moved with purpose. I stayed frozen, watching as it disappeared deeper into the woods. Sleep didn't come easily after that. I kept my flashlight ready and stayed alert. Every crack of a twig sounded like footsteps. The next day, I tried to keep busy. I packed some food and water and hiked further into the forest, away from camp. The sunlight helped calm me down. I kept checking behind me, half expecting to see someone following. The forest was denser here, and the air smelled damp and musty. I found some old tree carvings, initials and dates etched into the bark. The place was used by others before me, but that didn't comfort me. When I returned to camp late afternoon, I noticed the fire pit had been disturbed. The stones arranged around it were knocked over, some of the ashes scattered. My firewood pile had been moved, a couple of logs broken. I felt my stomach drop. Someone had been at my camp while I was gone. How close had they gotten? Why didn't I see or hear them? I didn't feel safe. I considered leaving immediately, but the sun was low, and the drive back in the dark on those roads didn't seem like a good idea either. That night was worse than the first. The noises were louder and more frequent. Scratches against the tent fabric, branches breaking nearby, footsteps circling around my fire. At one point, I saw a silhouette, tall and thin, standing just at the edge of the firelight, motionless. My breath caught. The fire flickered, casting eerie shadows. I stayed as still as possible, clutching my knife. The figure didn't move for a long time, then disappeared into the trees as silently as it had come. I barely slept. Every noise jolted me awake. My mind raced with questions. Who was this? What did they want? Why had they come here into this remote forest? Morning came slowly. I packed my things quickly, eager to leave but careful not to make noise. I walked to my car, eyes constantly scanning the trees. The forest seemed to close in around me, the silence oppressive. Just as I reached the clearing where I parked, I saw fresh footprints in the dirt, human footprints, leading away from my camp toward the road. But they were new, only a few hours old. I got into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. The forest stayed still behind me as I drove away, but I kept glancing in my rearview mirror. The feeling of being watched stayed with me long after I left the forest behind. When I got home, I called the local ranger station and told them what happened. They said there had been reports of trespassers and people living illegally in the forest, sometimes following campers or causing trouble. It wasn't the first time someone had felt unsafe out there. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was to get out without an encounter. What scared me most wasn't the darkness or the wild animals. It was knowing someone else was out there, close enough to reach me, and silent enough to disappear without a trace. Since then, I haven't gone camping alone. The forest isn't just nature. It's also a place where people can hide, and sometimes those people aren't safe to be around. The end. I hadn't been camping alone in years, but something about that weekend made me want to go back to it. Life had been too fast lately. Traffic, noise, constant notifications, and meetings. Everything was blending into a blur. I needed something to shake me up. Not in a bad way, but I needed to feel something real again. Something raw. I didn't want comfort. I wanted discomfort that I chose myself. And camping had always done that for me. I picked a random location on a map. I wasn't looking for a national park or a tourist-filled area. I wanted quiet. I zoomed in until I found a remote patch of green somewhere in the north part of the state. Dense forest, no major roads leading through it. There were some satellite images that showed an old dirt road cutting through part of it, maybe used by hunters or people with four-wheelers. No campgrounds, no visitor centers, just trees and whatever was hiding in them. It was a Friday morning when I packed the car. I didn't bring anything fancy. My old green tent, a fold-up chair, 2 gallons of water, a knife, a small hatchet, my sleeping bag, matches, a flashlight, some protein bars, instant coffee, and a couple of changes of clothes. I threw in a small first aid kit and a map I printed out from my computer. I left my phone in the glove box. I didn't want it to ruin the point of going out there. I told my brother I was heading up to a random patch in the woods and texted him a rough location, just to be safe. The drive up was quiet. I didn't see another car once I left the highway. I passed maybe 2 gas stations and an abandoned-looking bait shop before I turned onto the road the map showed. It wasn't really a road anymore. It looked like it had been paved at one point, but now it was broken up with weeds and grass pushing through the cracks. I could see tire tracks, though, so someone had been out here not long ago. About 10 minutes into the drive down that road, the pavement disappeared completely. It became a dirt trail, narrow, full of rocks and dips that forced me to slow down. My car wasn't made for off-roading, so I parked in a little clearing I found and figured I'd hike the rest of the way in. The sun was still high when I strapped my pack on and locked the car. The forest was thick, humid, and completely quiet. Not peaceful quiet, dead quiet. It felt like something had sucked the sound out of the air. Even the wind was still. I didn't hear birds or squirrels. No insects buzzing. Just the sound of my boots on dry leaves. I hiked for maybe 40 minutes, mostly uphill and weaving through trees. I kept glancing behind me without really knowing why. The woods were so dense that the light coming through the leaves had this green tint, like I was underwater. I found a spot that felt flat enough, next to a steep drop-off where the hill dropped away to the creek bed below. That side was all brush and fallen logs. No way for anything to approach without making noise. It made me feel better. I like having at least one side covered when I camp. I cleared some space, pitched my tent, and set up a small fire pit using some rocks I found. I wasn't planning to make a big fire, just enough to boil water and keep the dark at bay later. I sat down in the fold-up chair and took a deep breath. It was exactly what I wanted. No people, no noise, just me and the forest. But even with the quiet, I couldn't relax. There was something off about it. That silence didn't sit right with me. I listened harder and realized there were no natural sounds at all. I've camped enough to know that even in remote places, you still hear birds, especially in the late afternoon. A hawk, a woodpecker, something. But this place was completely still. I told myself it was just my mind adjusting to being alone. I boiled some water, ate a protein bar, and laid back on the ground for a while, staring up through the canopy. I dozed off for a bit, not sure how long, and when I woke up, the sun was dipping behind the trees. The air was starting to cool. I added a few sticks to the fire and lit it up. That's when I first noticed the sound. It was faint at first, like something dragging through leaves, way off to my left. I sat still and listened. It stopped. I stood up, holding the flashlight but didn't turn it on yet. I stared into the trees, blinking hard, trying to make out shapes between the trunks. Nothing moved. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. Could have been a branch falling. I was tired and probably just jumpy from the quiet. But the dragging sound came back, closer this time. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the dark, bouncing off the branches and trunks, but I didn't see anything. I walked a few steps toward the noise, sweeping the light side to side. Still nothing. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, not breathing much, not moving. Eventually, I went back to the fire and sat down, keeping the flashlight in my lap. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept hearing the dragging sound every hour or so, always from a different direction. It would come and go, soft and slow, like someone walking with one foot and dragging the other behind them. It was too slow to be an animal, too deliberate, but I never saw anything. The fire burned low, and I added some sticks every time it got too dim. I didn't want to be in total darkness, even inside the tent. I stayed outside most of the night, sitting in the chair, just watching the trees. Eventually, around dawn, I felt myself dozing off. The fire was just glowing embers by then, and the dragging sound hadn't come back in a while. I climbed into the tent and zipped it up, still in my clothes. I kept the flashlight beside me, just in case. I woke up maybe 3 hours later. The tent was hot and stuffy, full of that late morning heat. I unzipped it and crawled out. The first thing I noticed was that there were boot prints near the fire. Not mine. I froze. They were clear in the dirt. The heel and tread didn't match mine. They were deeper too, like whoever made them was heavier. They circled the fire once, then led toward my tent and stopped just a few feet away from the door. Then they turned around and went back into the woods. I walked around the site, heart pounding. I didn't see anything else disturbed. My gear was still there, but those prints, they hadn't been there the night before. Someone had come to my camp in the dark. They didn't try to take anything. They just stood outside the tent for a while, then left. My stomach dropped. I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't boil water, didn't eat anything. I tore down the tent in record time, stuffed it into my pack, and left the fire pit as it was. I started heading back the way I came, but the woods looked different now. Everything felt tighter, more narrow, like the trees were closing in. After about 20 minutes, I realized I didn't recognize anything. The trail was gone, or maybe I had never really followed one. The ground was all the same: leaves, rocks, and roots. No clear path. I stopped and tried to get my bearings. I didn't panic at first. I figured I'd keep going downhill, maybe find the road. But the forest was twisting in ways I didn't remember. I walked in what I thought was a straight line, but I passed the same downed tree twice. I kept seeing the same rock with a crack down the middle. That's when I started to panic. The sunlight started to fade again, and I hadn't even found the dirt road. I should have reached the car by then. I hadn't even gone that deep. I kept walking. I didn't stop. Every now and then, I'd hear something, branches snapping behind me, or the sound of something heavy moving in the undergrowth, always just behind me, just far enough away that I couldn't see what it was. I'd stop walking and the sound would stop. Then when I started again, I'd hear it again, always following. I didn't want to believe it was a person, but it didn't sound like an animal. It never got closer, just stayed with me, keeping its distance. Eventually, I found a small clearing and decided to stop before it got too dark. I didn't want to set up the tent. I didn't even want to build a fire. I just sat with my back against a tree, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, and waited. The dragging sound came back around midnight, but this time it didn't stay at a distance. It got closer and closer until it was just behind the trees. Then it stopped. I waited, holding my breath, watching the edge of the clearing. Nothing, no movement, no sound. Then, after what felt like hours, I heard it again, farther away this time, like it had circled me and moved on. I stayed there until morning. I didn't sleep. I just sat with my back to the tree, scanning the trees. When the sun came up, I started walking again, fast and without stopping. Took me almost the entire day to find the road again. When I finally saw the cracked pavement, I almost dropped to my knees. I ran the last quarter mile to the car. Everything was still there. The windows weren't broken. The tires weren't slashed. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main highway. I pulled into the first gas station I saw and just sat there in the parking lot, hands shaking, engine running. I didn't tell anyone the full story. I told my brother I got turned around, that I heard some animals at night and decided to leave early. I didn't mention I had been planning that camping trip for a long time. My job had been eating up all my time for the past year, and I needed to get away from the city, from people, from everything. I didn't want a regular campground with noisy families and bright RVs. I wanted real peace and silence, real woods. So I chose a remote spot deep in the forest of northern Idaho, somewhere off a service road that barely showed up on the map. It was the kind of place where no cell signal reached, where there were no power lines or lights in the distance, just trees, dirt, and whatever lived out there. I packed the basics: tent, sleeping bag, water, food, lighter, small stove, and a good knife. I brought a revolver too, something I usually never did, but something about going that far off the grid made me feel like I should. Not that I expected anything to happen. I've camped alone before and never had trouble, but this time felt different. Maybe because I was going farther out than ever before. Maybe because I told no one exactly where I was going. I just left a vague note for my brother saying I'd be gone for a few days and would call when I got back. The drive took most of the morning. Paved roads turned into gravel, then gravel turned into muddy ruts barely wide enough for my SUV. I passed no one, not even another car parked on the side. Eventually, I found the small clearing I had marked on my map and stopped there. It was perfect, flat, surrounded by thick trees, and far enough from the logging road that I wouldn't be seen by anyone driving past, if anyone even did. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, just under some thick pine trees that gave good cover. The air was cool and still. All I could hear were birds and the distant sound of water, probably a stream somewhere downhill. After a simple lunch of trail mix and jerky, I went exploring. I walked through the woods, made a rough loop around the area so I wouldn't get lost, and returned to camp before dark. Everything felt calm, peaceful even. I didn't feel watched or uneasy. It was just quiet. That first night, I slept fine. I heard the usual forest sounds: branches cracking under animals' feet, maybe a deer or a raccoon nearby, but nothing unusual. I kept my flashlight and revolver next to me just in case, but I didn't need them. The fire had burned low by the time I zipped into my tent and closed my eyes. I remember waking up once to pee and seeing the stars so clearly I just stood there staring at them for a while. It was beautiful. The next morning, I made coffee on the little stove and sat on a folding chair outside the tent. I watched the trees and breathed in the cold morning air. It was everything I wanted. Peace. No emails. No deadlines. No noise. I spent the day walking farther out into the woods, following a game trail I'd spotted the day before. I found the stream and filled my bottles with filtered water. I found a few animal tracks, nothing big. A squirrel or two jumped from tree to tree above me, but otherwise the forest felt empty. Still, but when I got back to camp that evening, something was off. At first, I didn't notice it. Everything looked the same. Tent still standing, gear still where I left it. But as I got closer, I saw that the folding chair had been moved. I had left it facing the tent, but now it was turned toward the trees. Not just a little off, but fully turned around, like someone had sat in it and watched the woods. My stomach twisted. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at it, wondering if maybe the wind had blown it that way. But there was no wind, and the chair wasn't light enough to spin like that. It was weighted, metal, and had rubber feet. I checked all my gear. Nothing missing. Nothing moved. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. Someone real. I walked around the perimeter, looking for boot prints or broken branches. I didn't find anything obvious, but the ground was soft in a few places, and I saw what could have been a heel mark, maybe a toe. But it wasn't clear enough to say for sure. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound made me freeze. A twig snapping made my hand grip the revolver tighter. I stayed awake until well past midnight, staring at the fabric of the tent above me, listening. But eventually I passed out, too tired to fight the sleep. The next morning I got up early, packed up some food, and decided to hike in the opposite direction of the game trail, just to clear my head. I didn't want to overreact. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe I had turned the chair without realizing. I didn't like feeling paranoid, especially when I was alone out here, but that unease stayed in my chest all day. I couldn't enjoy the quiet anymore. Now it felt like the silence was watching me. When I got back that evening, I noticed something new. My tent flap was unzipped, only a little, like 3 inches at the bottom. I knew I had zipped it up all the way. I was careful about things like that. The zipper was stiff. It didn't slide easily on its own, and I had double-checked it when I left. Now, seeing it slightly open, I knew it hadn't happened by mistake. Someone had unzipped it. I looked inside. Nothing was missing, nothing moved, but the fact that it had been touched made me sweat. My throat felt tight. I zipped it back up and stood there, thinking. I had no cell service, no GPS, no quick way out. I built my fire big that night, bigger than usual. I kept the revolver on my lap as I sat in the folding chair, facing the woods. I didn't eat much. I didn't drink. I didn't want to have to pee and leave the fire. I watched the trees until my eyes hurt, but I didn't see anything move. No flashlight beams, no shapes, nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat awake inside the tent, listening. I held the gun in my hand. Hours passed. Maybe it was just in my head, but I swore I heard slow steps near the edge of the trees, like someone walking carefully over dry leaves, testing how quiet they could be. But every time I lifted my head to listen harder, the sound stopped. By morning, I was exhausted and cold. My hands hurt from gripping the revolver too tight. I made a decision. I'd leave that day. I didn't care that I'd planned for more time out there. Something was wrong, and I didn't want to be around to find out what. As I packed, I noticed something that made me stop cold. On the back side of my SUV, someone had dragged a stick or finger through the dirt on the rear window. Just one line. It wasn't there when I arrived. I'm sure of it. I had checked the vehicle after parking it. That line was fresh, and it meant someone had walked around it, touched it, watched it. That pushed me over the edge. I threw everything into the back. Didn't bother folding the tent properly. I just shoved it in, slammed the door, and got behind the wheel. The road out was narrow, full of ruts, and I drove faster than I should have, bouncing hard over rocks and dips, but I didn't care. I needed to get out. I kept checking the mirror, looking for a person, a car, anything, but there was nothing. When I finally reached pavement, I didn't stop. I drove all the way to the nearest town, parked at a gas station, and sat there with the engine running for almost an hour. I watched people walk by, normal people going about their day, and that's when I realized something that made my chest go tight again. I hadn't seen another car or person the entire time I was in the woods. Not one, not even on the drive out. And yet someone had been near me. Someone had watched me, moved my stuff, touched my tent, circled my vehicle. I checked my gear later that night, after getting a cheap motel room and locking the door with both the bolt and chain. Everything looked normal, but as I was going through the side pockets of my backpack, I found something I hadn't packed. It was a small strip of red fabric. Looked like part of an old flannel shirt, frayed at the edges, stained. I hadn't seen it before. It hadn't been there when I packed. That hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had put it there. They had been close enough to reach into my gear, and I hadn't noticed. I reported it to the local sheriff the next morning, gave them the location, told them what happened. They took notes, said they'd check it out. I don't know if they ever did. They never called me back, and I didn't follow up. I haven't been camping since. That trip killed it for me. I still love the outdoors, still hike sometimes near town, but I never sleep out there anymore. Not alone. Not where no one can hear me if I scream, because now I know what it feels like to be watched by someone who never shows their face. Someone who doesn't take anything or hurt you, just watches, gets closer, leaves small signs, and waits. And the worst part is knowing that if I hadn't left when I did, if I had stayed one more night, I might have found out what they were waiting for. Or maybe I wouldn't have found out at all. Maybe no one would have. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. Just me, my backpack, and the wilderness. I needed a break from the city. The noise, the rush, the endless faces that never really saw me. I wasn't a stranger to the outdoors. I had camped before, nothing too extreme, but enough to know the basics. I packed light, but enough to last a couple of days alone. The spot I chose was somewhere I had heard about from a local hiking forum, a remote forest area about 3 hours from the nearest town. No official campgrounds, no ranger stations, just deep woods and a river nearby. I wanted silence, solitude. I wanted to disconnect. The drive was uneventful, the roads getting narrower and bumpier as I got closer. The last stretch was a dirt road, barely maintained, with potholes and patches of mud from recent rain. I parked near a small clearing where the car wouldn't block any paths and double-checked my gear before heading in on foot. It was late afternoon when I started hiking. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows between the trees. The forest was dense, tall pines mostly, with thick underbrush and a faint smell of earth and pine needles. The air was cool but not cold. Birds flitted about, and every now and then I heard the rustle of small animals moving in the bushes. The ground was soft under my boots, covered with a mix of pine needles, leaves, and scattered stones. I found a good spot for my camp not far from the river I had marked on my map. The river was narrow but fast-moving, clear water tumbling over smooth rocks, making a constant gentle roar. It was the kind of place that felt untouched, a little wild. I set up my small tent, arranged my sleeping bag, and started gathering firewood. The sun was just about to set, painting the sky orange and pink through the gaps in the trees. I made a fire with some dry twigs and branches I collected, the flame catching quickly. The warmth felt good against the chill creeping in with the night. I boiled some water on my small stove and ate canned beans and bread, simple but filling. I watched the fire dance, shadows flickering on the trees, feeling a deep calm settle over me. As darkness fell completely, the forest changed. The shapes around me became stranger, the noises sharper. The river's roar sounded louder in the quiet night. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, sat closer to the fire, and tried to relax. Then, something caught my attention. A faint, irregular sound from the edge of the clearing where the trees met the open space. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer moving through the brush, but the sound didn't fit. It was slow, deliberate, like something dragging across the ground. I stared into the dark tree line, trying to see movement. The firelight didn't reach far enough, and the shadows there seemed thick and unyielding. My heart beat faster. I reminded myself it was just the wilderness, and wild animals often made strange noises. Still, the sound repeated, soft, scraping, slow. I grabbed my flashlight from the tent and aimed the beam into the woods. The light hit a patch of bushes, shaking gently. My eyes scanned the area, but I saw nothing obvious. No eyes reflecting back, no movement beyond the sway of the branches in the wind. I turned off the flashlight, deciding to stay near the fire, keeping the light and warmth for now. The noises stopped. I settled back, but sleep didn't come easy. My ears were alert to every small sound, the crack of a twig, the distant splash of water, the rustle of leaves. I kept reaching for the small knife I had tucked beside me, even though I hoped I wouldn't need it. Around midnight, the forest fell completely silent. No wind, no animals, nothing but the slow, steady flow of the river nearby. I closed my eyes, but every few minutes, I'd open them, sensing something watching. Then I heard it again, the scraping noise, closer this time, moving slowly around the perimeter of the clearing. It sounded like something big. I sat up sharply, shining my flashlight toward the sound. The beam landed on a shape moving low to the ground near the treeline. It was too dark to see clearly, but it was definitely a human figure, crawling or dragging itself through the brush. It wasn't running, just slow, methodical. My heart nearly stopped. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The area was dead silent except for the river. The figure paused for a moment, then vanished into the shadows. Panic hit me like a wave. I grabbed my backpack and started gathering things, thinking of leaving immediately, but the dirt road was 3 hours away, and I was deep in the forest. I knew the path back was poorly marked and it was easy to get lost at night. I tried to stay calm. I checked my lighter and fire starter kit, ready to light the fire again if needed. The figure could be anyone, a lost hiker, someone injured, or worse. I didn't want to assume the worst, but couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone and that whoever that was had no good intentions. I packed up my tent quietly, making sure to leave no sign of my presence if someone came looking. The moon was bright now, casting a cold silver light over everything. I decided to stay put near the fire, keeping it lit, hoping the light and warmth would keep whatever was out there at bay. Time passed slowly. The scraping noises stopped. I waited for hours, eyes darting around, nerves stretched thin. Dawn was still a few hours away when I heard a different sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching on the dry leaves and sticks. I grabbed my knife again, my hands trembling. The footsteps circled the clearing, getting closer to where I was hiding behind a thick tree trunk, just out of sight. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed perfectly still. Suddenly, a figure stepped into the firelight. A man, dirty, wearing torn clothes. His face was dirty, his eyes wild, but he didn't say a word. He looked exhausted, like he had been out in the woods for days. I realized he was probably not dangerous, more lost than threatening. I stayed hidden, watching him carefully. He stumbled to the fire, collapsed on the ground, and didn't move. Relief mixed with caution flooded me. I wasn't alone, but I also wasn't in immediate danger. I waited until the sun rose, brightening the forest. I decided to approach slowly, knife still ready. The man was unconscious but breathing. I checked his backpack, some old food, a water bottle almost empty, a torn map. It was clear he had been lost, maybe for days. I built a bigger fire, boiled water, and carefully gave him some to drink once he woke. He didn't speak, but I could tell from his weak nods and gestures that he was grateful. I knew I had to help him get out. Together, we packed what little gear he had, and I found my way back to the car, following the river as a guide. The forest still felt eerie, but having someone with me made it less frightening. We walked slowly, taking breaks, keeping alert. The man's strength was fading, and I felt responsible for him now. After several hours, we finally heard the distant hum of cars and saw the edge of the forest opening to the road. I flagged down a passing truck, and the driver took us to the nearest town where the man could get medical help. Later, when I was safe in my own home, I reflected on that night. It wasn't ghosts or monsters in the woods that scared me. It was the unknown, the isolation, and the sudden confrontation with another lost soul in a wild place where help wasn't easy to reach. That night taught me that nature was powerful and unforgiving, but it was also full of unexpected moments of human fragility and connection. The sun was just dipping below the tree line when I pulled off the main road onto the gravel path leading to the campground. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, the kind of scent that immediately settles into your lungs and reminds you of being far from the city. I had decided to spend a few days alone in the forest, just me, my tent, and the quiet of nature. No phone, no internet, no distractions, just the wilderness and me. The place was called Red Pine Campground, nestled deep in a national forest that few people visited this time of year. Setting up camp was straightforward. Pitch the tent on level ground, clear away the sticks and stones, and stack some firewood nearby. I double-checked everything as twilight fell. Tent secured tight, backpacks stashed under the rainfly, water bottles filled, stove ready. The crackle of dry pine needles beneath my boots was the only sound besides distant bird calls and the rustling of small animals in the bushes. Felt peaceful. The sky above was a deepening shade of blue with stars beginning to twinkle here and there. I started a small fire, careful not to let it get too big, just enough for warmth and to cook some canned beans I'd brought. The flames flickered, casting long shadows around the campsite. As the night grew colder, I wrapped myself in my jacket, staring into the fire and listening. The forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, the occasional hoot of an owl, the scurry of something in the underbrush. But beyond those natural noises, there was nothing unusual, just the peaceful hum of night. I went to bed early, zipped into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. But the forest had other plans. Around midnight, I woke to a noise. At first, it was faint, a soft crunching, like someone stepping carefully on dry twigs. My heart jumped, and I froze. The noise wasn't close, but it was definitely near. Somewhere out beyond the ring of light my campfire gave off. I lay still, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't an animal. The steps were too deliberate and slow. No rustling or scrambling, just slow, careful footsteps. I reached for my flashlight, which was within arm's reach, and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness but revealed nothing. No movement, no figure, just the thick trees and bushes standing silent. I wanted to tell myself it was a deer or some other wild creature, but the way the steps moved, methodical, slow, stopping and starting, felt off. I tried to calm down and listened. The footsteps stopped abruptly. Silence returned, so thick I could hear my own breathing. Then, suddenly, a faint scraping noise at the edge of the firelight. Something was dragging along the ground. I grabbed my small pocket knife and held it tight. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the feeling of unease grew heavier with every second. My mind raced through possibilities: a lost hiker, an animal caught in something, or worse, someone with bad intentions. I sat up slowly and switched off the flashlight, hoping not to draw attention. The noise stopped again. I heard nothing but the night sounds. I tried to stay awake, but the tension made me exhausted. Eventually, I fell back asleep, the knife still in my hand. The next morning, I woke early, the sun casting weak rays through the canopy. The first thing I did was check around my tent. On the ground near the entrance, I saw footprints, large, heavy, and not like any animal I knew. They looked human but messy, as if whoever made them had been walking carefully on uneven ground. More disturbing were the marks near my fire pit. A scrap of fabric caught on a stick, frayed and dirty. I hadn't dropped anything like that, I scanned the surrounding woods with a sinking feeling. Something or someone had been close to my camp overnight. I packed my things carefully, trying not to panic. My plan was to hike out the way I came, but I wanted to check a little more first. As I moved away from camp, I found more signs. Broken branches at waist height on the trees, fresh scratches on the bark. These weren't random, they looked like markers or warnings. I didn't know what they meant, but they felt deliberate, as if someone wanted to mark territory or leave a message. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't call for help. I told myself to keep calm and focus on the trail. The path was narrow and winding, with fallen leaves crunching beneath my boots. But then, I started hearing the footsteps again. Slow, heavy, keeping pace just behind me. Every time I stopped or quickened my step, the steps matched me. Panic started to set in. I tried to look over my shoulder, but all I could see were the dark shapes of trees. The forest felt suddenly too quiet, as if everything was holding its breath. I knew I wasn't alone, but I couldn't see who or what was there. I started running, branches whipping at my face and arms, the rough ground threatening to trip me. The footsteps grew louder, faster, and I felt something close behind me, almost brushing against my back. I stumbled on a root and fell hard, scraping my palms and knees. When I looked up, no one was there, but the footsteps stopped. I scrambled to my feet and ran harder, finally breaking out of the woods and onto the gravel road. I didn't stop until I reached my car, heart pounding, sweat soaking my clothes. I locked the doors and sat inside, trying to catch my breath. The sun was fully up now, and the warmth felt safe compared to the cold fear of the night. I called the park ranger's office and reported what had happened. They told me the area was known for some hikers getting lost, but didn't mention anything about other people lurking around. Still, they promised to send a patrol. I waited in my car for what felt like hours, eyes scanning the tree line. Eventually, a ranger arrived, radio in hand. They listened to my story, nodded, and agreed to check the area more thoroughly. The ranger drove me out of the forest, and as we left, I looked back once more. The trees were quiet again, but the feeling of being watched lingered. When I got home, I checked my gear carefully. Under my tent flap, I found a small, dirty stone, smooth and heavy, that hadn't been there before. It was a simple, physical reminder that someone had been close enough to touch my camp, close enough to follow me through the woods. I didn't know who or why, but that experience stayed with me long after the bruises healed. The wilderness might be peaceful by day, but at night, it hides secrets you're never meant to uncover. And sometimes, the scariest thing isn't a ghost or monster. It's just the reality that someone, somewhere, is watching you when you think you're alone. I took a trip into the woods alone, mostly because I needed to get away from people for a while. My head had been a mess lately. Work stress, family problems, and just the usual city noise that never stops. Phones ringing, horns honking, doors slamming. I needed quiet, real quiet, so I picked this small forest preserve about 3 hours from home that I found online. It wasn't popular, didn't have flashy trails or campgrounds with families and campfire songs. Just raw land and a few designated primitive camping spots. That was perfect. I left early in the morning, packed light but smart, tent, tarp, sleeping bag, basic cooking gear, knife, water purifier, extra batteries. I had done solo trips before, so I wasn't being stupid. I had my GPS, a compass, a trail map I printed, and even downloaded the offline maps on my phone in case I lost signal. The place was called Black Hollow Woods. Never heard of it before that week. I only found it by looking at Google Satellite View and spotting a green patch with barely any reviews. I got there around 10 a.m., parked my car in a gravel lot that was half covered in weeds, and shouldered my pack. The air felt still, too still, but it was peaceful. No other cars, no other people, just me and the trail. The path wasn't very well marked, but I followed a narrow dirt trail that split off from the lot. It was mid-June, hot but not unbearable, and the forest was thick with green leaves and undergrowth. Branches arched overhead and filtered the sunlight, casting patches of shadow everywhere. It was beautiful in that wild, untouched way. After hiking about 2 miles in, I reached the site I had marked on the map. It wasn't a real campsite, just a flat clearing between some birch trees near a small creek. I dropped my pack, rolled my shoulders, and stood there for a while just listening to the running water and the faint rustle of wind in the leaves. That's all I wanted, no talking, no notifications, no pressure. I set up my tent around noon. Nothing fancy, just a small one-person tent with a rainfly. I laid out my sleeping bag, set up a tarp in case of rain, and boiled some water for instant noodles. After I ate, I explored the area around the creek. There was something calming about the way the water curved around the rocks, slow and clear. I took off my boots, dipped my feet in, and laid back on the grass. Around 4 p.m., I heard a sound that didn't belong. A low snap, not like a squirrel or a falling branch. Heavier. I sat up. Nothing. I stood and looked through the trees. Still nothing. It was probably a deer. This place was full of wildlife, and I was far enough from people that animals wouldn't be as afraid to come close. But something about it made me uneasy. It wasn't the sound itself, but how sudden it was. How close. Like something was watching and stepped back just when I turned my head. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't help checking over my shoulder every few minutes as I collected some firewood. I had brought a compact axe and a small folding saw, so I made quick work of some dead branches. I had a decent pile by sunset. I lit the fire with a ferro rod and some cotton balls soaked in petroleum jelly. Flames caught quick. I sat close and listened to the crackling. The warmth helped push back the chill that crept in as the sun disappeared. The forest got dark fast. Not just dark, black. The kind of dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face unless it's near the fire. I turned on my headlamp and did a quick sweep around the area. Everything looked fine. No animals, no tracks, no movement. Still, I felt watched. You know how sometimes your skin prickles and you don't know why? That's how I felt. Like eyes were on me, just past the edge of the trees. I had this tight feeling in my chest, but I ignored it and told myself I was just being paranoid. I was alone. My brain was just looking for problems to solve. That's what brains do when they're bored. I got in the tent around 10 p.m. and zipped the door shut. I kept my headlamp on the lowest setting and scrolled through some offline articles I had saved on my phone, trying to tire my brain out. But the feeling didn't go away. I heard twigs crack outside. Once, then silence, then another snap farther away. I sat up and turned off my lamp. Total darkness. My heart started to thump in my ears. I waited. Nothing. Just when I started to relax, something brushed against the tent. Not a hard bump, just a light stroke along the side fabric, like a branch or someone dragging fingers. I froze, didn't breathe. I grabbed the knife beside my sleeping bag and kept still. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I started drifting off, a noise snapped me back. Rustling leaves, a soft crunch, or a faint thud. But there was nothing when I checked. My fire had died down hours earlier. I didn't want to leave the tent and start it again. I just stayed in my sleeping bag with the knife clutched tight. When dawn finally came, I stepped out and checked the area. I found something that made my stomach twist. A set of partial footprints about 20 feet from the tent, right near the edge of the trees. Bare feet, no shoes, just heel and toes pressed into the dirt. Not animal, not mine, human. They led from the woods to about 30 feet behind my tent. Then they vanished. No prints going back the way they came. I thought maybe it was some old hiker trail. Maybe someone else had been here. But the tracks looked fresh. The edges were clean. No leaves settled in them. I crouched down and saw a small drop of blood on a nearby leaf. Just one. Tiny. Dried already. My hands were shaking. I decided to pack up. I had planned to stay 2 nights, but no way I was staying again. I wanted out of those woods. I tossed my gear together as fast as I could, kept my knife on my hip, and stomped out the fire remains. But as I started the hike back, something felt off. I kept getting turned around. The trail wasn't the way I remembered. The creek should have been on my left, but it was on my right. Then I realized I hadn't crossed a certain log I remembered. My GPS showed I was heading west, which was wrong. I stopped and took out my compass. North was where I had just come from. I turned around. Suddenly the woods felt different, heavier, like the air was thicker. I heard no birds, no insects, just the sound of my boots on dirt. I picked up the pace. I didn't want to run. I knew that was the easiest way to twist an ankle or miss a marker, but I walked fast. Then I noticed something else. A tree with a red X carved into it. I hadn't seen that on the way in. I stopped, looked around. About 20 feet ahead, another tree had a red X. Then another. It was like a path. Someone marked it, but not with paint. This was carved deep into the bark, fresh cuts, like with a blade. I wasn't sure what it meant. I didn't want to follow it, but my GPS started acting up. The screen froze, then flickered off. Wouldn't turn back on. I pulled out my phone. No signal. Battery at 43%. I turned on the offline map. It loaded, but the dot showing my location wasn't moving. I shut it off to save power. I started walking again, ignoring the red-marked trees, trying to backtrack the way I remembered. After about 20 minutes, I reached a spot that looked familiar. A small rock formation and a cluster of dead logs. I recognized them. I relaxed a little. Then I saw something that made me stop cold. A piece of fabric hanging from a low branch, about the size of a sock, torn and faded, looked like part of a shirt sleeve. It wasn't mine. It was stained dark brown and had a tear along the edge like it had been snagged. I looked around again. That tight feeling came back in my chest. I didn't want to believe it, but everything pointed to one thing. Someone else had been in these woods. Maybe still was. And they weren't just hiking or camping. They had been near my tent. They had left those prints. I kept moving. My steps were quicker now, breathing shallow, trying to stay quiet. I listened harder with every footfall. Then I heard something. Whistling. Faint. Off-key. A slow tune. I froze again. It stopped. Silence. Then a second whistle. This time from the opposite direction. It was like someone was trying to get me to move, to head toward one and away from the other. Hurting me, I crouched behind a tree and held still. My heart slammed in my chest so loud I could hear it in my ears. My hand gripped the knife so tight my knuckles turned white. The whistling came again. Closer. I bolted. I didn't care about stealth anymore. I sprinted, ducked low branches, jumped over roots, crashed through brush. I didn't know where I was going, just away from the sounds. After a while I stopped, panting, legs burning. I had no idea where I was, completely turned around. My compass pointed northeast, so I turned west and kept moving, hoping I'd stumble onto the trail or a landmark. Then I saw it, an old structure, deep in the woods. A cabin, not a nice one. This was a collapsed shack. Half the roof was gone,